Good morning, everyone. We have Krista Thomason from Swarthmore College, who will present to us Kant's Enlightenment and Pascal's Misology.
Great, thank you so much. Oops, you know what? Let me get my stopwatch up. Okay. Buenos días. Mi español es muy mal, pero muchas gracias al Instituto y al NACS. Estoy muy feliz y emocionado de estar aquí. All right, I will not embarrass myself any further by doing any more Spanish. Thanks to everybody for being here in the what I have lovingly titled the Kant and session of Kant and some other person. So the first and today is on Pascal. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback because I want you to tell me what it is that I care about when I'm writing this paper, because I'm not actually totally sure what I care about. So I think a lot of people are aware of Kant's remarks about Rousseau's Misology, and I think that's pretty well known. I think that maybe somebody who's been under-examined in terms of their Misology is Pascal. So I am interested in the ways Kant talks about Pascal's Misology, and I think when we examine that, we end up with an interesting look at Kant and the way he figures in the Enlightenment. This is something that I'm currently interested in. So this is the kind of the way this project fits into this sort of larger project about Kant's kind of overall standing in the Enlightenment and how he sort of fits, and in some ways how he doesn't fit with other Enlightenment philosophers. So Pascal, my interest in Pascal is kind of coming from that direction. The thing I'm going to start with is some sort of like background context a bit. Because there's actually two different, the paper is titled Misology, but there's another kind of related concept that I need to get on the table first, and this is in the section 1 of your handout. So this is about enthusiasm. So there's a scholar, J.G. Pocock, who has this great paper who talks about, he has this term where he says that enthusiasm, and I'm going to define that in a second, enthusiasm is the Enlightenment's anti-self. And the way he comes about that is by showing how, and this is indeed the case, there are many Enlightenment philosophers who wrote about enthusiasm. And that's even true sort of prior to the Enlightenment. You have, even if they don't have standalone treatises on the Enlightenment, on enthusiasm, they have many sort of comments about enthusiasm throughout their work. So like, I give you a quick list there. And of course, some of these Kant was familiar with. So what is enthusiasm? Well, that's the $64 million question in the Enlightenment also. The Enlightenment themselves didn't actually know precisely what enthusiasm was. They defined it, many of them defined it differently. And when they were writing about it, they sort of really struggled to kind of fix what the meaning was of enthusiasm. But they were concerned about it. Many of them were mostly concerned about sort of religious enthusiasm. So if you're wondering, like, Krista, give me a definition of it. I can't just yet, because in fact, it's different depending on which author you're talking about. And that's actually relevant to the interpretation of Kant that I'm going to offer here. So those of you who know Kant probably know that he wrote also about enthusiasm in the same way many of his Enlightenment contemporaries did. Many of his Enlightenment contemporaries were interested in, particularly in the religious kind of enthusiasm. So you see this, for example, in Voltaire really heavily. I am going to argue that, in fact, Kant doesn't think that religious enthusiasm is kind of the primary concern that he has. Religious enthusiasm is rather a subset of this larger category of enthusiasm that he's more concerned about. And I'm just drawing on this first section kind of draws on some of my earlier work. So if you're interested, and I can tell you the name of that paper if you want to read more about this. I do want to say kind of a small note for those who are familiar with the literature. There is a terminological issue in the German. There are two different words in Kant that get translated into English as enthusiasm. There's enthusiasmus and Schwärmerei. I have fought, Robert's not here, I've fought with Robert about this, about which way to translate these things. Some scholars think that you need to translate these two words differently and use different English terms. I think that's probably not the case. So just as a quick aside, when you actually look at the different things that Kant says about these two different types of so-called enthusiasm, he doesn't keep the terms consistent. He doesn't keep the descriptions consistent particularly well. And so I don't, even though there is a terminological difference, the main terminological difference that the main substantive difference you can see is that he tends to say worse things about Schwärmerei than he does about enthusiasm. And that's about, for my money, that's about all you can conclude from that. So if you guys want to fight with me about that, we can fight in the Q&A about that. But yeah, I think that there's enough slippage that the terminology is not, it's not that helpful to sort of think about it in terminological dispute. So let me set that aside. So as I was saying, Kant does talk some about religious enthusiasm. That's a really hot topic for many of the Enlightenment philosophers. I think it's a subsidiary concern for him for the most part. So, and again, drawing on earlier work that I've done, Kant has this phrase where he describes enthusiasm in the religion as the moral death of reason. And I think that's a nice way to encapsulate what he's most concerned about. The place where you see this really clearly is in the orientation essay, so I'm just going to read that somewhat long quote on the handout. So he describes the process of what it is like for someone to sort of like get wrapped up in enthusiasm. He says, first, genius is very pleased with its bold flights, since it has cast off the thread by which reason used to steer it. Soon it enchants others with its triumphant pronouncements and great expectations, and now seems to have set itself on a throne which was so badly graced by slow and ponderous reason, whose language, however, it always employs. Then its maxim is that superior law-giving reason is invalid. We common human beings call this enthusiasm. So I'm going to sum up a bunch of text that I've sort of gathered and kind of tried to reconstruct, again, in an earlier article. So enthusiasm happens for Kant when you take some other source of, I'm going to call it inspiration. He sometimes calls it illumination, divine revelation, inner inspiration, something along those lines. You take some other source as your main mode of trying to sort of understand things about the world. And key to that is trying to go beyond the supersensible. So enthusiast, his favorite example, of course, is Emanuel Swedenborg, right, in Dreams of a Spiritseer. That's his like go-to typical example of a person who's an enthusiast. And the enthusiast is someone who kind of casts off reason because it's not allowing them to get what they want, which is a sort of like looking beyond the realm of the sensible into the supersensible and trying to understand things about the supersensible. And they take as their guide, rather than reason, they take as their guide something like inner illumination, divine inspiration, divine revelation, something like that, thinking that that thing is going to get them this picture, whatever it is that they want, understanding the deep fabric, deep secrets of the universe. And reason's not going to do that, so they abdicate, right? Reject reason in some sense. And that, I think, is his main concern about enthusiasts. So you could have a religious enthusiast who does that, but you can have other kinds of enthusiasts who does that, and he has plenty of examples of that. Okay, so that's just some background on enthusiasm. Given that this was a hot topic in the Enlightenment, and it was, many philosophers, as I said, wrote about it, struggled to actually fix a meaning of what they were talking about. They were very explicit about the fact that they didn't necessarily know how to define it, but they all mostly thought there was something concerning about it. There might be some good types here and there, but there's something concerning about enthusiasm. So what might be the remedy if you're an Enlightenment philosopher and you're worried about this? How do we avoid enthusiasm if it's something that we should avoid? So I'm going to give you Voltaire's answer. He has in the Philosophical Dictionary in his entry on fanaticism, he says, well, the cure has obviously got to be philosophy, right? Do enough philosophy and that's going to prevent enthusiasm from happening to you. As he says, just a couple of quotes there, he says, there's no other remedy for this epidemical malady than the spirit of philosophy, which extending itself from one to the other at length civilizes and softens the manners of men and prevent the access to the disease. He specifically thinks the ancient philosophers were free from this danger. The effect of philosophy is to render the soul tranquil, and fanaticism and tranquility are totally incompatible, right? So why not just think, well, look, we're good Enlightenment philosophers. If we just do enough philosophy, and if we just, guide ourselves by reason, we're going to be fine. No enthusiasm, no worries about enthusiasm. Maybe this is a hot take. I don't think this is Kant's view. I don't think it can be Kant's view. So why don't I think that? Because I think Kant identifies because he's not so concerned with religious enthusiasm, I think Kant identifies a strain of enthusiasm that he identifies with dogmatic metaphysics and philosophy. right? So while Voltaire thinks there is no enthusiasm in philosophy, I think Kant thinks there is, right? Or at least there's the danger is presented. So why do I think that? I grabbed a bunch of quotes from a bunch of places. Dreams of a Spirit Seer is obviously one of my faves. He talks about like what are the advantages of metaphysics. So one of the advantages that he cites is the possibility that you might be able to understand things beyond the sensible world. Nope, that's not going to work. What else? So what else is metaphysics good for in Dreams of a Spirit Seer? It's that we are able to use it to determine the limits of human reason. Right? And so what does that help us prevent? It helps us prevent doing the things that dogmatic metaphysicians do when they encourage flights into, quote, empty space on butterfly wings. He uses a lot of wings analogy in this kind of thing. So the idea of reason is like flying beyond the sensible. Critical metaphysics, his project, right, is to sort of fold those silken wings, as he's going to put it, back on the humble ground of common sense. This, of course, comes to its full fruition, obviously, in the First Critique, where in the orientation essay, he describes the First Critique as a work that clips the wings, right, of the dogmatist in respect to the cognition of supersensible objects. The whole point of philosophy, on his view, right, again, in the First Critique, is to reveal the deceptions of a reason that misjudges its own boundaries constantly. So reason is always tempted to go beyond. He says that several times. Reason's always tempted to go beyond its boundaries, right? And he recognizes that this is humiliating for reason. And indeed, it comes from, as he puts it, a feeling of reason's own need, right? Its own need. Reason is the one that wants to fly, right, off into the supersensible world and try to understand things. So if that's right, then contra Voltaire, who thinks philosophy and the proper use of reason are going to be the cure for enthusiasm, I think Kant is worried that that all by itself is not going to fix it. Unless we're doing metaphysics in the right way, unless we're doing philosophy in the right way, there is still this possibility of enthusiasm sort of creeping in, even into philosophy, okay? So that can't be the straightforward, reason and philosophy can't be the straightforward solution. Now, the problem gets worse. I think Kant thinks his own critical project also opens up the doors for enthusiasm in a different way. So he has really gotten himself in quite a pickle. And this pickle is the pickle that I'm particularly interested in. He had an example of this. The kind of misology and enthusiasm that he is concerned about, he had an example of this in Pascal. And I think he knew that. That critique of Pascal was well known in the Enlightenment. And so I think Kant knew about this critique. And I think he sees this concern. This concern is his own critical project also opens the door to a different sort of enthusiasm that ultimately leads to a kind of misology, or a kind of enthusiasm, a kind of misology that leads to enthusiasm. All right, what's that going to look like? Moving on to section 3, my long section 3. Forgive my overly verbose handout. Let me give you a quick primer for those who may not know a lot about Pascal maybe and his kind of status in the Enlightenment. Let me give you sort of a quick primer about that. So, and I'm just drawing on other scholarship, other scholars. I'm borrowing friends of mine who have, they're not friends, I don't know them, but other scholars who have written about Pascal. So why was Pascal this kind of interesting figure in the Enlightenment? He was really well known for his early work in science and mathematics. And so many of the Enlightenment philosophers thought of him as kind of like, he's one of us, he's our guy. And then as his career progressed, he became obviously more and more interested in religious writings. That started to make them nervous. And then when the Pensées comes out, all hell breaks loose. Because it looks from, and I'm mostly drawing on Voltaire's critique, looks like our guy, Pascal, who seemed like he was on Team Enlightenment with us, has totally jumped ship and has become kind of the worst form of some kind of like religious enthusiast, basically, right? So they experienced Pascal's kind of, the trajectory of his work is almost a betrayal. So there's lots of intricate stuff happening with the Port Royal edition of the Pensées and how that doesn't really reflect exactly the plan that Pascal had for the Port Royal edition, for the Pensées. It's the only edition that Voltaire would have known. It's the only edition that Kant would have known. There's enough overlap, I think, that it makes sense, but I'll get into at least a few of those details in a second. The major critique that you see of Pascal that I'm pretty sure, again, do I have a smoking gun on this? No, that Kant was probably familiar with was Voltaire's. So Voltaire, in the 25th letter in Philosophical Letters, writes this scathing attack on Pascal. and he pulls direct quotes from the Pensées, argues against them. He describes, he says that Pascal tries to show man in an odious light in the Pensées. He pulls all these quotations that Pascal says things like, mankind is plagued with blindness and misery, without light and abandoned to himself, lost in his little corner of the universe. And Voltaire sort of makes it his mission to argue against this horrible picture of mankind that Pascal gives. He specifically labels Pascal a fanatic and says that he Voltaire, is going to take the side of humanity against the sublime misanthrope. And he does exactly that in the 25th letter. So this was a really scathing criticism. Let me do a quick aside into Misology, since maybe we need to do background information on that. So let me come back to Kant's vision of Pascal in a second. That's like, what does Pascal look like in the Enlightenment more generally? Misology. Happy to define that. So probably the most famous definition where misology happens is in the groundwork, hatred of reason. It, as he puts it, arises in those who have experienced the most with this use of reason, and they find that they have only brought more trouble on themselves instead of gaining in happiness. He has a couple of other definitions that I think are also pretty relevant to his dispute with Pascal. He's talking about people who have initially pursued the sciences with great industry and fortune, but who then find no satisfaction in the whole of their knowledge. It's a distrust, as he puts it, in the whole of human cognition. It arises out of reason's futile effort to fulfill knowledge. If the person can't accomplish, this full knowledge they want with reason, they resort to simple-mindedness and renounce reason altogether. So that sounds like, if you're me, at least, that sounds like the progress that he describes in the orientation essay, right? So you have somebody who is very unhappy with their use of reason. They're disillusioned, they're disappointed in the fact that they cannot understand things about the universe beyond the sensible. And so as a result of that disappointment, they feel in some sense betrayed by reason, and so they abandon it, right? They leave it. That's the enthusiast. So I think the enthusiast and the misologist are kind of closely tied. Not every misologist is going to become an enthusiast, but it can happen. So I think that's the thing that Kant's worried about, and I think he's worried about it because he knew about Pascal, because Pascal was this kind of person. So why do I think that? Well, Kant talks about Pascal. Doesn't talk about him a ton, no systematic discussion of Pascal, but he does mention him specifically in a couple of places. So I've got the Vigilantiest in there. The reason I have that one in there is because I think it mirrors really closely Voltaire's critique. So it's some of my evidence that I think Kant was familiar with that critique, because he mentions the Jansenists particularly, and Voltaire does the same thing. So Voltaire knows that the Port Royal folks kind of got their hands on Pascal. That's his view, at least. And I think Kant is kind of like parroting that. So I'm not going to read that quote, but I think he knows that that's what's happening. So that's my evidence that he's familiar with Voltaire's critique. The two places in the published work where Pascal appears is in the Anthropology. And he links Pascal with the discussion of enthusiasm. So he mentions enthusiasm specifically when he talks about Pascal. So the first place is on the intense self-observation passage in the Anthropology. And this self-observation, as he describes it, can lead to enthusiasm and madness. The warning is given, so he's warning about self-observation. The warning is given, because this is the most direct path to illuminism or even terrorism, by way of a confusion in the mind of supposed higher inspirations and powers flowing into us without help from who knows where. For without noticing it, we make supposed discoveries of what we ourselves have carried into ourselves, like Bourgeois, forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce her name, and his flattering ideals, and Pascal with his terrifying and fearful ones. Forgive me, the other person mentioned is Antoinette. Forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Bourgeois. She was a pietist mystic. For some reason in that particular section in the Anthropology, he says his, but Kant knows she's a woman because he talks about her in other places as a woman. So I don't know, I don't know why that's there. She was well known for having this like beautiful vision of sort of God in the world that was full of love and light and delight, and Pascal's was horrible and terrifying, and man was full of misery. So Kant likes to contrast the two of them, but he thinks they're both enthusiasts in the same way, because they're getting their information from inner inspiration, divine illumination. He pairs them again in the second place, right, in the on the illusions of inner sense, which, as he puts it, consists in taking imaginings for sensations and is either enthusiasm or spiritualism. So again, this is how it is with the fanatically exciting inner sensations of a Reunión or the fanatically frightening ones of Pascal. This mental depression cannot be conveniently cleared away by rational ideals. the tendency to retire to oneself, together with the resulting illusions of inner sense, can only be set right if the human being is led to external. I don't need to read the rest of that quote. Anyway, okay, so he pairs both of them, and those are his two kind of main mentions of Pascal. So let me walk through what I take to be the dangers of Pascal's Misology. So the original plan, talk a little bit about the pensées. The original plan for the pensées for Pascal was to, and we get this from like his own descriptions and letters and stuff, was to kind of walk, he imagined his reader as the humanistic, atheist, modern Enlightenment figure. That was his reader. And his plan was to walk that reader through kind of using just regular old empirical observations, but also just kind of regular old reasoning strategies. Kind of try to convince them that, as a matter of fact, mankind is miserable and in a horrible suffering condition. Like, look around you. People are awful. People are miserable. Man is confounding. He is constantly doing one thing, saying another, never happy, awful, right? Things are bad. And then the plan was to sort of show if that's the case, you might try to make sense of that world using your, fancy Enlightenment tools of, delightful proper reasoning, but you can't do that. That's not going to work either, on Pascal's view. And then what you should be doing is abdicating reason and seeking salvation and divine grace. That's what you should be doing. Okay. That was the kind of the plan for the pensées. The Port Royal edition doesn't exactly follow that plan. It's out of order. But you can get sort of enough of the project to sort of see why Kant might be concerned about it, particularly given the following change that the Port Royal folks made. So the Port Royal folks put some of Pascal's more horrible fragments kind of toward the end of the pensées. They were originally supposed to be kind of in the beginning. They put them at the end, and they put them at the end after a section that is titled "The Portrait of a Man who has wearied himself with searching after God by his bare reason, and who begins to read Scripture." So it looks like, this is me imagining how Kant is understanding this. It looks like the progression in the pensées is you are wearied with the use of your reason, and because you are wearied with that, you then start to read Scripture. Once you start to read Scripture, here are all these horrible fragments that come after that are like bizarrely piecemeal and also terrible. So I think Kant might, again, a lot of this is speculative, I understand, is looking at that progression and seeing the progression from Misology to enthusiasm. I am wearied with reason. It has disappointed me. And so because of that, I am going to try to read Scripture. And then in doing so, I'm going to try to get messages from sort of the divine. And when I do that, my thinking basically unravels. And now I'm in this like weird fragmentary space where I'm thinking horrible things about human cognition. So I think Kant looks at Pascal and says, that's a person who is both misologist and enthusiast. The reason I think Kant is concerned about that is because I think he's nervous that the critical project invites this problem. It invites Misology because it tries to convince people who are otherwise curious human beings interested in the use of reason because they're good Enlightenment folks. It makes them disappointed because what is Kant telling you? What's the story he's giving you? He's telling you that despite what you might think, reason is not going to allow you to fly into the supersensible and understand things beyond experience and grasp the sort of whole secrets of the universe, despite much what you might want. That's not going to happen. So if we're going to do philosophy well, we have to undertake the critical project. We have to not be dogmatic metaphysicians. We have to give up that goal to understand what's beyond, right? And I think Kant is sensitive to the idea that that might be pretty disappointing for people. That might disappoint people like Rousseau, that might disappoint people like Pascal who want this, and other Enlightenment figures who do believe in kind of the promise of reason in some sense. And so I think he thinks this critical project at least invites this possibility. All right, so you don't have to agree with any of that I just said, but where do I want to end? So this is the part where I need your help. I have just like a set of concerns. I have a set of questions that I end on. This whole exchange and this whole thing about Pascal, I think gives us an interesting picture about the way Kant fits or doesn't fit with the Enlightenment project, and how we understand the Enlightenment project, and how we understand his role in it. He's not a reason skeptic, we know that, but he's sensitive to this, I think. And so that puts him in a really tough position. From my perspective, what I want to ask is, what does Kant think he can do about this problem, if he really thinks it's a problem? What can he offer the sort of curious Enlightenment philosopher who believes in the prospect of reason, which seems like a central piece of the Enlightenment project? What can he offer that person so that they don't feel betrayed, so that they don't feel disappointed, so that they will get on board with the critical project and realize that it's the only way to go if we're really going to make any progress, if we're going to do what we want to do, this is the way to do it. But what are you going to give to somebody who's worried about that? This is also part of my kind of very, very long-standing interest in Kant's views about what does it mean to be a good thinker? And what does it mean to sort of get people on board with the project of reason in a world where there's so many other tempting things out there that you might want to go for that might suit you better, suit your needs better. I think that problem is a contemporary problem. I think Kant thinks that was an Enlightenment problem as well. So that's kind of where that's sort of like where this project is fitting in this bigger story that I'm interested in. And I'm really grateful for your attention today, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. So thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have 13 minutes for questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
We're going to do the Donahue thing. This is fun.
Hello. Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Before
Oh, for YouTube. Okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Ashley.
Hi, Ashley.
I mostly just have a question about, I guess, the history and the scholarship.
Yeah.
Because I would have thought that rejecting reason, if we think of that as like a God-given capacity, would be a sin.
Right.
And so I'm
Yeah.
just like curious about how that is captured in this kind of
Yes.
history.
Yes. Yeah, that's a fight between Pascal and his sort of other fellow folks who were like writing religious folks at the time. So there was a divide about who thought you could provide reasoned arguments. Right. Is reason sort of a God-given power? Yeah. So there's some theology that I'm gonna be real careful because the theology is like this is not my strong suit. But what I do understand is that there is a dispute between Pascal and other folks at the time. Pascal just doesn't think that you can provide reasoned arguments about theology. Like you end up, and I know the wager. I know. The wager's like real messed up, guys. I don't know what to do about the wager. But like that's like, but because his standing commitment is that this is not going to work, and that was his plan for the Pensees all along. So that doesn't fit, and I don't know what to do about the wager. I have no answer to that question. But yeah, that's a dispute that he has. Yeah. So he doesn't think that that's a promising way to go about. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Krista. I'm Melissa Fahmy. I really liked that. I really liked thinking about Kant being scared of,
I think he is.
Misology. And I hadn't really thought about this problem before. But I wonder if, we could see Kant as sort of offering, sort of his whole project is like consolation prizes.
Oh, interesting.
Like the practical postulates. Like reason can't give you freedom, but it can give you the practical postulate, and it can give you the practical postulates of immortality and God, and it can give you, rational faith.
Yes.
It's not. You could still have religion, and you could still have hope, within. So I don't know, is that? What do you think about that possibility?
Yes. Definitely. And this is part of this is kind of like stage 2, right, of the project. Is like stage 1 is kind of identifying that he is in fact concerned about this, and stage 2 is kind of like, well, what does he imagine himself doing if he's really concerned about this and sensitive to it? What does he imagine himself doing to address it, like to kind of give it, consolation prize, I like that. So what I'm really curious about is kind of working out how to understand, particularly the critical philosophy as responding to this problem if it is. So one possibility might be, well, look, you can't have these other things that you might desperately want, but maybe you can have something else instead. Then I think the trick is to show whatever that something else is, it's not just a like, sad, you know what I mean? It's something, it's good. It's because I think he does believe in it, right? He believes in the project. And so I think the next stage for him is to really show, my own answer would be not so much as a consolation prize, but rather what you are looking for is not even something, not that you can't even have it, it's like not even something you really want. Like what you want is this, what I'm actually offering you. It's what you can have, but it's also what you, it's gonna, like this is what you actually need, or this is what you actually want. Like I think he wants to have a more positive defense.
I would say, like, we probably want more
yeah.
than what we need.
Right.
But like it's a good
yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
You're not gonna suffer a lot.
Right, that's right. Yeah, but this is exactly the kind of territory that I sort of want to figure out next. Is like, what's the answer, right? What's the offer? Yeah, thank you. So thank you for that suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, it's very a similar remark. I was going to phrase it more or less like this: that for a believer and for a reasonable person, maybe, and I wonder what you think about this. Kant's religious thought may offer certain advantages to the Wolffian dogmatic project, because that project, in order to obtain cognition of God, sort of has these predicates of God that, like principle, sufficient reason, force, that are sort of univocal with everything else, and sort of brings God down to our level, and whereas
Doesn't like that.
Yeah, whereas Kant's project is sort of constructs a more orthodox, even a transcendent notion of God, which doesn't do that, which may actually satisfy the believer, and maybe is done in such a reasonable way. Also,
Right.
the Enlightenment. That's a thought. And also, from this perspective, I wonder what you would say about Kant himself. I don't understand him, because he loves metaphysics, like apparently so much.
He loves
right?
it.
Passionate love for metaphysics. But I've heard from other sources that as a person he was essentially maybe even apathetic or ambivalent about the existence of God.
Yeah.
I don't know how to reconcile that. I don't understand. What might you? I just don't know.
Sure,
So what might
sure.
your thoughts be about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think for the purposes of this project, I kind of want to disentangle Kant's kind of critical project, the critical stuff that's happening in the first critique, from the religion, even though I can understand why you'd make the connection between those two things. And I'm not sure I think it's actually a separate question, what he thinks he can offer someone who's the believer, right? The believer in God. I don't know if that's the same, I'm not sure if what I'm talking about is even going to address that question. So I think I would kind of want to put them separately. But you're totally right. He does love metaphysics. He does. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned, other folks have brought this up as well in the scholarship on Rousseau and Misology, is that Kant himself seems to kind of understand. It's almost like he kind of gets why Rousseau was unhappy and why he was a misanthrope. And I think he probably gets why Pascal was a misanthrope and why he was a misologist. Because I think Kant himself was at some point, if he's not tempted necessarily toward a kind of misanthropy, but he's sensitive to why people might go in that direction. So I think when he's talking about this, he's coming from a place of getting why you would, which to me lends more support for the fact that he is sensitive to this possibility and is legitimately concerned about it, because I think it's something he himself experienced. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So,
Hi, Avery.
my name is Avery Goldman. Thank you so much for that. So for the part 2 of this project,
Yes,
which you
please.
haven't done.
Thank you.
I mean, you've already sort of set it up by referring to the orientation essay.
Yes.
And that might be a good place to look, where he's
Yeah.
really
Mm-hmm.
responding
Yeah.
to,
Right.
this, where rationalism is pantheism is Spinoza, and Jacobi's rejection of that, and so that this attempt to rehabilitate reason in a way that Mendelssohn maybe undersells it. Seems Vernunftglaube, like these rational beliefs, and how they might orient us not just in terms of religion, but in terms of all sorts of other areas, might be a good place.
Definitely. I think it's very much building on that. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thanks. I just had a very small, it was like a follow-up to those two comments earlier. Wouldn't you say that for Kant, we do get freedom through reason in some sense, like the fact of reason?
Yeah.
We contemplate the moral, I mean, that seems like not just a consolation prize, but the best thing. And he would also say, like, the only way we can have that is through transcendental idealism, otherwise not free. So that seems good. I mean,
No, that does seem good. I mean, I think he's, it's not that there's not good things, right? And I do think he is a little, so yes, but I think he's also kind of more concerned about the more, I guess what I'm going to call, this is probably not the best way to put it, but the more sort of substantive concerns in kind of theoretical, right, in the theoretical world, about what kinds of beliefs we can have and what we can really know. So more of the epistemology sort of project, like what can we really understand about the world? And so I think he is kind of sensitive to that people want that thing. And so you give them freedom and that's great, but like they might want this other thing too. And so that's the thing where I think he's struggling, in my own mind, I think he's kind of struggling to figure out what he can tell those people who want those things.
I agree, like there's this very lengthy phrase of like the sense of loss.
Yes.
It really is there in the theoretical side for Kant. Yeah,
For sure.
I agree.
Yeah. But thank you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I was curious about what you
Efrain, did you
about...
introduce yourself?
Sorry?
You need to introduce yourself.
Okay. Thank you. So, what was I going to say?
Sorry, I made you lose your train of thought.
No. It's. I was curious about the historical political aspect of enthusiasm.
Yes.
Because while I think you're absolutely right that Kant is concerned about this danger of enthusiasm in metaphysics as to our possibilities of accessing things in themselves and things like that. But I think in the historical political writings, one might find like a strain along which enthusiasm might play a very positive role politically.
Yes.
And this is in line with the idea that nothing big can be achieved without enthusiasm, which is also like a Enlightenment motto.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts about?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Did Robert pay you to ask that question? Okay. I'm joking. That's yes. So there are lots of places where Kant seems to say positive things about enthusiasm, and one of the places where he said, like one of the more consistent positive things he says about enthusiasm is this idea that it's a kind of, there's a spiritedness to it that can, and he even goes so far as to say, like, nothing great can ever be accomplished without it. So that's him, if you're asking me, that's him borrowing heavy duty from from Voltaire and from Shaftesbury, both, I think, because they both have that view. They have a much more, not in the fanaticism, so Voltaire has two different entries and where he talks about this. So the fanaticism, he's like scathing, but then in the other entry, he's less scathing. And he's the one who sort of says, look, enthusiasm is great, but reason has to sort of be its guiding hand. So enthusiasm is the one that, he has this great imagery where he's like, enthusiasm is the one that takes the pen, but reason guides the hand of enthusiasm, which is nice. So I think Kant is kind of drawn to that more, whatever they're talking about there, that sort of positive aspect of enthusiasm. My current view, but you can talk me out of this, or you can try talk me out of this. My current view is that even though he says those like few positive things, I don't think it outweighs the bigger concerns that he has. So he's not ready to sort of say, he's not ready to go all in and say, yeah, we definitely need this thing. I think it's him being pulled in that direction and recognizing that it can be useful in these ways and recognizing that it might be important. But I actually don't think he's that committed. Like, he's not as committed as Shaftesbury, he's not as committed as Voltaire to that view. I think he is, but he's drawn to it. So so many of the remarks on enthusiasm are so maddening because he's just like constantly in two different directions about this. This is like my own view about this. So constantly pulled in these two different directions. And so like sometimes he'll swing over to the positive side and then he'll swing right back over to the negative side. So I think because he's so ambivalent, I'm not ready to say that he actually does kind of give it pride of place. But you can fight with me about that, Avery, if you want to.
All right, we're out of time.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So let's continue with our Kant and table with Avery Goldman and let me just get the name of your talk right. There we go. Kant and Mendelssohn on the relation of the political and the personal. Do you have handouts? Yes.
This is the mic. Okay. Good. Thank you.
You don't need this one.
No.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for being here, and I want to thank the organizers and North American Kant Society for putting this on and including us. So thank you very much. This paper is really about the political implications of Kant and Mendelssohn's engagement in the pantheism controversy, and it forms a part of a bigger project in which I'm looking at Kant's use of post-critical metaphysics in different areas of his thought, and so this is in the political thought, and I think it's worth engaging with Mendelssohn because Kant engaged with Mendelssohn so very much across his work. So I'm going to be reading a paper. The handout has quotes from the 4 different sections, so I'll point out when they come up. All right, so I'm going to begin. The title is Kant and Mendelssohn on the relation of the political and I'm not very happy with the title, the personal, but it's really on the political and our vocations. Something like that would probably be a better title like that. Moses Mendelssohn's 1783 Jerusalem offers an account of the relation of politics and religion that might be thought to have much in common with the Kantian conception of the relation of politics and morality. Mendelssohn argues for politics of religious tolerance, proclaiming religious freedom as the proper goal of our political systems. In this way, Mendelssohn might be seen to be offering a religious version of the Kantian distinction between politics and morality. In both, the political is juxtaposed against our vocation, be it religious, Mendelssohn, or moral, Kant, while at the same time the political is in service to our vocation. For Mendelssohn, the goal of his political writings is religious tolerance, offering citizens the opportunity to practice their religion. And for Kant, the goal of the political is producing the conditions for moral life. However, the service the political offers our vocations is conceived quite differently by Mendelssohn and Kant. While both Mendelssohn and Kant conceive of the political as not only permitting our freedom of thought and religious practice, but also helping individuals in their moral development, and yet, while Kant conceives of the possibility of political progress, Mendelssohn holds out no such hope for the progressive development of the political realm. In this paper, I will investigate such different conceptions of the political. I will begin with Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, where he first lays out his plea for the political as the realm of tolerance, before elucidating Judaism as a fitting religion that rejects all coercion on matters of faith. I will then turn to the pantheism controversy, where in response to Jacobi's provocations, both Kant and Mendelssohn lay out their respective conceptions of political judgment. Kant will be seen to have reaffirmed his political teleology, offering the prospects of progress through its connection to the noumenal realm of the moral law. While Mendelssohn makes it clear that the metaphysics that guides his rational faith offers nothing to our political deliberations beyond the demand for religious tolerance. What will be shown is that already in his Jerusalem, Mendelssohn's founding of his political system on religious belief can be seen to imply the very deflation of reason to common sense, Gemeinsinn, that Kant incorrectly assumes is merely a late capitulation to Jacobi. So that Mendelssohn had this all along, this view. Mendelssohn's 1783 Jerusalem is divided into two sections, the first concerning the state and the second concerning religion, and in particular, Judaism, following Mendelssohn's conception of the sharp division between the two. Mendelssohn wrote this work near the end of the long reign of Frederick the Great, the Prussian monarch, who ruled from 1740 to 1786. In Jerusalem, Mendelssohn praises Frederick as the wise monarch who understood that tolerance was required in matters of religion because faith couldn't be prescribed. This was no small matter in 18th century Europe. Jewish life in Europe was particularly precarious, depending on the goodwill of monarchs who often permitted Jews to live in their states only if they paid exorbitant tax penalties. Mendelssohn was thankful that Frederick was tolerant of other faiths, permitting to practice their religions, although not without restrictions on their daily lives. Mendelssohn viewed himself as both an intellectual and political intermediary between Jewish and German culture. Politically, he worked to protect Jewish communities, arguing for religious tolerance. In particular, he argued against things like the extra taxation and the possibility of expulsion in Prussia and in cities such as Altona near Hamburg, Dresden, Alsace, and even Kant's Königsberg. And intellectually, Mendelssohn tried to explain to both Jews and non-Jews how Judaism, properly understood, fit within both the cultural and political life of Europe. His Jerusalem was the culmination of this project of both literal and metaphorical translation. Okay, so part one of Jerusalem concerns the state. Mendelssohn here relates his political philosophy to that of Hobbes, describing the political realm as the guarantor of security while criticizing Hobbes for enforcing laws merely punitively, and so not attempting to inculcate morals. Mendelssohn argues that the excellence of a form of government doesn't lie in the power of the sovereign. Rather, the form of government is successful when its morals are internalized by its citizens. Mendelssohn clearly does not mean that just any internalized value deem a state excellent. The values must permit the civil liberties for which Mendelssohn claims Hobbes had no sense, had no taste or sense. Keinen Sinn. The second part of Mendelssohn's Jerusalem focuses on whether Judaism can be so conceived. Judaism in Mendelssohn's account is not a revealed religion, and this is the quote on Section 1, the first number 1, it's not a revealed religion directed by the revelation of a deity in the manner that he understands Christianity, but a divine legislation that was revealed to them by Moses in a miraculous and supernatural manner. It was not God who was revealed at Mount Sinai, but the law, a supernatural legislation rather than a supernatural revelation of religion. And so Mendelssohn explains that in Judaism, assent is not a question of believing in the unknowable, but of a kind of knowledge of the divine, which is to say of truth and untruth. Mendelssohn turns to the biblical Dvarim, Deuteronomy, where the Jews are reminded that they know, Yadata, today, and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God in the heaven above and on the earth below. Knowledge of God leads to following the law. Mendelssohn explains that even those biblical passages that seem to refer merely to faith or belief, Glauben, are better translated as trust, Vertrauen, which need not be opposed to knowledge. In the book of Genesis, Bereshit, what is translated in the King James Bible as and he, Abraham, believed, Hamin, in the Lord, Mendelssohn claims should be, and he trusted Hamin in the Lord, trusted in what he knew. The Hebrew root is used for both of these terms. And in fact, Robert Alter, in a recent sort of excellent translation of the Pentateuch, translates as trust rather than belief here. But what is it that practitioners of Jewish law know? Mendelssohn explains that all of the practical laws that the Bible commands refer to or are based upon eternal truths of reason, or remind us of them and arouse us to ponder them. Such eternal truths are either necessary or contingent. Necessary truths are like the truths of mathematics, immutable even to God, while the contingent, such as the laws of nature, which Mendelssohn explains follow the will of God as their denial is not itself impossible. They are immutable only insofar as it pleases God's will. In the Bible, these truths are presented to cognition, Mendelssohn says, through the laws that they command. These contingent truths, Mendelssohn explains, are offered to cognition as a source of insight into eternal truths, and so as a corrective to culture. While the laws are revealed to them by Moses in a miraculous and supernatural manner, they lead the understanding of the devotee not only to personal happiness by means of these truths, but also to the eternal, necessary truths about God. Thus, Mendelssohn endeavored to make the Bible and its connections to rational truth accessible. He emphasized biblical Hebrew rather than the Aramaic-influenced Hebrew of the Talmudic tradition, writing Hebrew texts of biblical interpretation and discussions of Jewish law, and translating the biblical Old Testament into German. This is a rational Judaism, an Enlightenment Judaism, but it's not Spinoza's Enlightenment Judaism. Unlike Spinoza, Mendelssohn limits the reach of rational inquiry. In a 1761 dialogue, Mendelssohn expresses his limited Spinocism or rationalism. His stand-in, Neophil, explains that the entire world of knowledge that Spinoza's views knows that Spinoza's views are quite absurd. And yet, Neophil goes on to say, actually, they're absurd only insofar as he wanted to apply them to this visible world outside of us. If Spinoza's metaphysical rationalism is decoupled from the visible world, if its explanatory power is limited to the realm of religion, then many of Spinoza's views, Mendelssohn says, can coexist with true philosophy and with religion. In this way, Mendelssohn transforms Spinoza's metaphysics into his own rational religion with no interest in governing the visible world outside us. Such a conception of a rational religion, Mendelssohn calls a revealed legislation, defending the division of state and religion by offering a rational religious practice that doesn't presume to govern. So then I'm going to turn to Kant, and this is the, quote number 2 from Kant's Religion. In Religion Within the Bounds of Reason, Kant is critical of the Judaism Mendelssohn describes, as although it doesn't currently direct a political state, its roots are those of a legal religion, supporting a political state, deeming Judaism, at least in theory, a theocracy that is not nearly as far removed from the political sphere as Mendelssohn claimed. Kant goes on to reiterate Lavater's demand from 24 years prior that Mendelssohn convert to Christianity, or at least have an argument why he shouldn't. Kant goes on even further, calling for all Jews to convert to Christianity, a pure moral religion freed from all the ancient statutory teachings. In Jerusalem, Mendelssohn counters Kant, before Kant's criticism, avant la lettre, defending Judaism as a legislative religion by arguing that Jesus himself followed not only the laws of Moses, but also those of the rabbinical tradition. Jesus, Mendelssohn argues, was no convert to such a revealed religion. While Kant disagrees with Mendelssohn's account of Judaism as a rational religion, conceiving it instead as a moral religion, he agrees with Mendelssohn about the need to keep the state out of religious practice. And like Mendelssohn, Kant praises Frederick, explaining in his What is Enlightenment essay that their age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. And this next bit is quote number 3. And yet Kant's praise for Frederick differed from Mendelssohn's. Kant didn't praise Frederick for his tolerance for the religion of others. Mendelssohn praised Frederick for exactly that, for allowing Jews and others to worship in ways other than the religion of the state. Tolerance, in the German Toleranz, from the Latin verb tolerare, to put up with, countenance, or suffer, is a willingness to accept the others with whom one disagrees. One need not have tolerance for what one respects. Kant thought Frederick went further than tolerance. Kant describes Frederick as a ruler who thus even declines to accept the presumptuous title of tolerance. The presumptuousness of tolerance is tied to the certainty that one's own way of doing things is correct, and that one thus merely tolerates others. Kant praised Frederick for holding out the possibility that the freedom he offered could benefit the society it criticized. The public use of reason is thus at the service of finding a better way of formulating laws. One need not be tolerant of that which holds such promise. Kant's explanation of such potential benefit, that of the progress of society, greatly differs from Mendelssohn's account of the state that should have as its goal merely that of religious tolerance. Their different views on what reason could offer our political deliberations were on clear display in their responses to Jacobi in the pantheism controversy. Okay, so this is section 2. The pantheism controversy. Mendelssohn's conception of the division of state and religion is exemplified by his heated engagement with Jacobi in the pantheism controversy that began in 1785. Jacobi publicly claimed that Lessing had pledged his allegiance to Spinocism on his deathbed. This was unwelcome news to Mendelssohn, Lessing's good friend, who thus set himself the task of refuting the claim that Lessing's Enlightenment rationalism, and by extension then Mendelssohn's own, was in fact a fatalistic pantheism. Mendelssohn's response in his Morgenstunden, his morning hours, and to Lessing's friends made it clear that he wanted to avoid the stigma of a full-blown rationalist pantheism by arguing for a reason that has no principles of its own, but is instead guided or oriented merely by common sense, Gemeinsinn. Mendelssohn offered in this way what he called a refined pantheism. In Morning Hours, Mendelssohn investigates what should be done when metaphysical speculation puts us at odds with our common sense. And this is part 2, quote number 1. Mendelssohn argues that such a common human understanding must orient us. We must restrain such speculation, which they reason, and bring our reason back in line with what is not just common, but healthy understanding, gesunden Menschenverstand. And while this might appear as if Mendelssohn is contradicting his earlier defense of the metaphysical truth of concepts such as God and the soul, we can see that like in his Phaedon, his reworking of Plato's Phaedo. In light of his earlier Jerusalem, what can now be understood is that for Mendelssohn, such an embrace of common sense reason doesn't contradict his metaphysics, but is the practical counterpart of such rational religion. Kant's sustained response to the pantheism controversy, his 1786 orientation essay, is an attempt to respond to Jacobi's claim that Enlightenment reason is ultimately pantheism, a fatalistic atheism without following Mendelssohn's deflation of reason to common sense. What Kant offers is a way, and there's a lot more that can be said about this, about the response to Weizenmann, but for now, what Kant offers is a way to interpret our continued reliance on the speculative metaphysical ideas that not only had Mendelssohn rejected in the name of common sense, but which Kant had demonstrated in the transcendental dialectic of the Critique of Pure Reason exceed our cognitive reach. Kant's essay locates the model for such use of post-critical metaphysics in our orientation in space. We're able to direct ourselves in our spatial environments by means of an ability to distinguish left from right, a feeling, ein Gefühl, that although it is not conceptual, governs our experience of the world. Kant uses the example of the felt difference between our left and right sides. I navigate the world by means of this felt distinction. Kant explains that we orient ourselves in a familiar but darkened room in this way. I bump into my office chair and navigate around it to get to the lamp and turn on the light. I do so without bumping into my desk. Such spatial navigation, Kant explains, depends on the felt distinction between my left and right hands. The lamp is on the left of my chair, and I know that. My desk is on the right. My ability to so navigate is not merely cognitive. The distinction between my left and right sides is not tied to any determined distinction. The ability to so navigate, Kant claims, bespeaks a felt distinction between left and right, what is for me fundamentally incongruent. And such a subjective, non-conceptual feeling is what allows me to orient myself as I negotiate, say, my darkened room. For Kant, such orientation in space is a model we can use to understand the way we orient ourselves more generally in thought. In our abstract thinking, we make use of the ideas of reason to orient ourselves. The ideas of reason, the soul, the world, and God, the very ideas that in the dialectic of the first critique, Kant has argued are unknowable, offer direction to thought. While the objects of these ideas are unknowable, the ideas can be thought without contradiction, as long as we refrain from claiming knowledge of them. And this is quote 2 in section 2 in the appendix to the, in the orientation essay, what had been called the hypothetical use of reason in the appendix to the dialectic is now described as a commitment to a pure rational faith, Vernunftglaube, which affords our orientation in thought. Kant is arguing that reason offers a certain direction, an orientation, and if we make use of reason in a way that is not at odds with, but is in fact fully in accord with the empirical use of our understanding, then these ideas of reason can be said to have oriented us. Kant describes the need of reason as twofold in that essay, both theoretical and practical. A person who has common but morally healthy reason can mark out their path in both a theoretical and a practical aspect. Kant explains this of Mendelssohn. Though Mendelssohn denied the practical authority of metaphysical ideas, it was through them that he, without knowing it, oriented himself in speculative thinking. The goal of Kant's essay is to bring to light the rule of such rational faith in the sort of implicit orientation of thought. Kant concludes the orientation essay by proclaiming that one must not contest the prerogative of reason, which makes it the highest good on earth. The prerogative of being the final touchstone, Probierstein der Wahrheit, of truth. Our common sense must not reject our metaphysical inquiries. Mendelssohn's willingness to embrace common sense as the limited criterion of political life already in his 1783 Jerusalem, so 3 years before he published on the pantheism controversy, accepts Jacobi's anti-rational path. Such a fundamentally skeptical approach to our faculties, Kant predicts, will bring the same misfortune down on the heads of other innocent parties. Frederick died in 1786, just before Kant published his orientation essay. Its final call to reason is in his reference to what could be lost. With the death of Frederick, Jacobi's challenge to reason, along with Mendelssohn's capitulation, could succeed in transforming their enlightened society, bring such a punishment on the heads of the innocent as well, Kant, but maybe also Mendelssohn, whose position as a Jew in Frederick's society was much more precarious. And while Kant doesn't explicitly address political judgment in this essay, his account of the dependence of thinking on orienting principles of reason makes it clear that for him such judgment is no mere pragmatic assumption of common sense as Mendelssohn deals it. Reflective judgment depends on regulative principles, deeming Kantian politics dependent on the post-critical use of metaphysics. And to look at this, I go to those places where Kant discusses that. So beginning in the third critique, Kant offers the clearest account of political judgment as teleological and so dependent on the regulative principle of systematicity, Zweckmäßigkeit, purposiveness, in the final sections of the critique of the power of judgment. Kant explains that the regulative principle of the systematicity of nature is presupposed not only in the reflective judgment of organisms, what he calls the internal purposiveness of nature, but so too in the political judgment of integrated natural systems, what he calls the external purposiveness of nature. Kant writes that such a regulative principle of the external purposiveness of nature explains not only the interconnection of nature, but so too of the social world, offering the regulative principle of the development of civil society. While the rational being can reflectively judge nature as internally or externally organized, it's only concerning itself that it can conceive of an end apart from the regulative principle of the systematic unity of nature. This is to say that we who reflectively judge nature in terms of its connection as a systematic whole for our reflecting power of judgment, but we know only ourselves as rational beings who conceive ourselves as the ultimate end of nature here on earth. And this next bit will be the first quote in section 3. We can serve ourselves in this way by developing the skills to overcome mechanistic desire and develop ourselves as rational beings. That we know. But Kant calls the conditions for such development, the political goals, as Kultur, as culture. The conflicting attempts by competing societies to provide the conditions for their citizens' moral pursuits leads to war. And the threat of such conflict leads to the goal of a cosmopolitan ordering of states, the systematic unity that external purposiveness promises as its regulative principle. A lot more could be said about this. In the third critique, Kant doesn't say much about this reflectively judged cosmopolitan whole that is to be conceived as a teleological claim born of the reflecting power of judgment. Kant's political writings can be read, I think, from this perspective. And the next from Perpetual Peace is quote number 2 in section 3. This is particularly clear in Kant's the Perpetual Peace, as we learn, where Kant explains that the pursuit of such cosmopolitan peace is one that offers approximation by unending progress. And what guarantees it, of such progress, is nothing less than the great artist nature, from whose mechanical course purposiveness shines forth visibly. In Perpetual Peace, or the Perpetual Peace, Kant makes it clear, contra Mendelssohn, that political decision-making is no mere common-sense project guided by a commitment to tolerance. Rather, political judgment is dependent on the regulative principle of the systematic unity of nature. Kant's disagreement with Mendelssohn over the role of metaphysical reason in our political deliberation is especially clear in his 1793 on the common saying, this may be true in theory but does imply in practice. Kant explains that Mendelssohn argues in his Jerusalem that while individuals make progress, humanity can't be thought to make such progress. And so this is quote number 3 from Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn writes, the quantity and weight of humanity's morality remain on balance about the same during all these various epochs. For every step forward, there is a step back, and so one can't presume to see divine providence in human history. Kant doesn't argue with Mendelssohn's empirical claim. Has there been progress in human history? Rather, his claim is that without the idea that humanity is progressing, without rational faith in providence guiding us, we would have lost faith in humanity and grow tired of the viewpoint of the spectator, watching their sad development. This is Kant's account of the French Revolution in say, the conflict of the faculties. Such a Kantian claim is that the optimism of the spectator is born of rational faith in God. The theological idea, which, as we have seen in the third critique and even earlier in the appendix to the dialectic of the first critique, is transformed into a regulative principle of the systematicity of nature which governs teleology. Kant's claim is that without such an assumption that our moral metaphysics can be brought to bear on our empirical lives, we would lose all hope for the progress of human history. Okay, so brief section on the competing arguments for enlightenment that Mendelssohn and Kant wrote. Did Mendelssohn contradict his own distinction between political and the rational religious in his attempt to improve the political conditions of his own religious community, sort of arguing that the Jews and other religious minorities should have rights? Kant saw it as such, but in so doing, he imputed his own conception of enlightenment to Mendelssohn. For Mendelssohn, enlightenment, the process of intellectual maturation, is a difficult task for an individual to achieve. For Kant, that is. He writes that there are only a few who have succeeded on their own. What makes enlightenment more easily attainable is the intellectual challenge that others offers for Kant. Such communal support of the individual's intellectual development requires the political freedom to use our reason publicly. By the public use of our reason, Kant famously intends the use that we make of our intellectual powers when we engage in discussion about how we should live and organize our societies. Such political freedom helps individuals enlighten themselves, pursuing their maturity, and so their moral natures. And it also benefits society. Kant explains that Frederick not only permitted challenges related to religion, but also challenges to his legislation. And so this is quote number 1 in section 4. The public use of reason was at the service of finding a better way of formulating laws. The only condition was that citizens obey the laws that they're criticizing. Until they're changed, the law, even as they raise challenges to them. This is what Kant means by historical progress, the teleological process of a people moving towards ever more fitting conditions for the individual to pursue their autonomy. And such historical progress is governed by the regulative principle of systematicity. In Mendelssohn's own Enlightenment essay on the question of, he denies Kant's claim that the political conditions correspond to the individual's enlightenment. This is Kant's fundamental claim in his essay. Mendelssohn disagrees, claiming that political enlightenment differs from that of the individual. While in both realms he conceives of enlightenment, Aufklärung, as the theoretical part of education, Bildung, he claims that the enlightenment of human beings can come into conflict with the enlightenment of citizens. The theological metaphysical truths of the individual's religious, rational enlightenment might conflict with the truths of the political order, which is not governed by such necessity. For example, Mendelssohn earlier claims in his 1763 on Sentiments that while the state may ask us to sacrifice our lives in its defense, we have a personal right to resist. In this, he agrees with Hobbes. But for Hobbes, this is because the state's authority comes from its obligation to protect our lives. While for Mendelssohn, the limit on the state is born of our commitment to strive towards our individual moral perfection. Such a conflict between the enlightenment of the polis and that of the individual is not a question for Kant, because the truths of the individual's enlightenment are the truths of political enlightenment. Any conflict between the political laws and enlightenment is addressed by means of Kant's distinction between the private and the public use of reason. We follow the rules of our civil responsibilities, but as citizens, we publicly criticize them, attempting to produce the political conditions of enlightenment. While Kant sees Mendelssohn's advocacy for the Jewish community as an example of the public use of reason, and so an implicit commitment to historical political progress and to regulative principles, to claim so is to misunderstand Mendelssohn. For Mendelssohn's political advocacy was intended merely to convince the state to permit religious practice with no assumption that doing so would generally improve society, with no assumption, that is to say, of political progress. And while religion can assist in persuading people to commit to morals, helping the state to enforce its laws, the moral progress would be the individuals and not the societies. Even Mendelssohn's work on behalf of Jewish education should be conceived as an attempt to transform the individual, rather than an act of Kantian public use of reason. In place of political progress, Mendelssohn offered only a rational faith. The moderate Jewish enlightenment, Haskalah, that he exemplified was not driven by the idea of political progress, but by an attempt to overcome religious intolerance and so make possible the practice of an apolitical rational faith. And just brief conclusion, in Kant's orientation essay, he views Mendelssohn's rejection of metaphysical reason and the embracing of a common sense political order as a capitulation to Jacobi's charge of pantheism, and thus a rejection of Mendelssohn's earlier metaphysical arguments. What I've attempted to show is that such a common sense politics was Mendelssohn's position even before Jacobi's charge of Spinozism. Mendelssohn attempted to separate politics and religion with the political animated only by the interest in protecting religious freedom and the individual's moral development. To deny metaphysics a role in the political in this way was to deny political progress, the defense of which was Kant's long-standing task. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you, Krista Thomason. Thanks, Avery. I like this paper. I learned lots about Mendelssohn. I want to ask about the role you're giving to sort of metaphysics in Kant's view about progress, for the following reason. Do you think there's a tension there between the reading that you gave and Kant's anti-colonial criticism in Perpetual Peace? The Perpetual Peace, sorry. Does that, because, and the reason I say that is Kant's sensitive to the claims that colonizers will use, imperialists will use, to justify, rationalize their imperialism, which is they use the language of civilizing and enlightening and progress to justify those actions, and Kant thinks that's illicit, right? They're just being flat out lying, right? So given that he's critical of that kind of rhetoric, do you see any tension there at all, or no? You think that's not a tension?
I mean, I think I don't see it. I don't think it's a tension ultimately, but it's certainly complicated. I mean, I think what I would say is, it depends what the presupposition of progress, of systematicity affords us. And so, like, the wide conversion of peoples one encounters coercively would be the kind of thing that Kant would criticize in the name of, if that were in the name of progress. Now, that's also complicated, right? Kant thought the Jews should all convert, right? But he thought the Jews should decide to convert, like that it was in there, whatever it is, and so that he didn't think was the kind of coercion that had gone on in colonialism with mass conversion, whatever it is. So I think that's the way I would split that, try to.
Thanks, Avery. I'm Clinton Tolley. Yeah, I was wondering, just especially about the end, and it's awesome that you're deep into the Mendelssohn in a way, so hopefully I can get you to say more on the Mendelssohn side. So the short piece on what is Enlightenment, so there in that piece, it seems like there's a distinction between Enlightenment and culture, and Enlightenment goes with more the individual, and culture goes more with the social. He also says, the Enlightenment is more theoretical, culture is praxisy or something. And so the suggestive what you had at the very end, that the Enlightenment can come into conflict with the enlightenment of, two different ways of thinking about the human being, can sound more dramatic absent the contrast between them.
Absolutely.
And culture. Yeah, so I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about, so that there could be a need for every individual to become enlightened, but some societies have already achieved it in some sense, is a different kind of point than whatever is happening with culture. Does that seem right? So that the enlightenment that would be needed so as to constitute the political structure might be one achievement, but then the cultural vocation in some other sense would just be a second achievement. And so then a conflict within the Enlightenment back and forth is not yet a conflict with culture at all. And so it's just like, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you're thinking about the interconnection. Is it like to achieve the cultural vocation it's not that you don't have to achieve the Enlightenment vocation, but they can be separated. It sounded at some point, especially the setup, that you were thinking that Mendelssohn thought there's no relation that has to be between the political structuring and the cultural form, except a kind of openness to the cultural fulfillment or whatever. And whereas with Kant, it might have seemed more like, well, no, it's a kind of stepwise relation. You have to solve the peace, social, political, Enlightenment stuff first, and then it allows for something with culture. And so that's why I think that you brought out nicely, the accord with reason in the social political is a necessary feature, and it's what gives rise to culture in the right way. Are you thinking that for Mendelssohn it really is deeply different, that it's not a stepwise dependence relation? I guess that's with that short piece, just a little bit more about the relation between Enlightenment and culture. Is there a dependence relation at all? And some of the ways you were presenting it to me, it seemed like they're just two tracks almost, and the Enlightenment, the last quote, suggests a conflict, but it's all inside of the Enlightenment, so I didn't know. Yeah, hopefully you'll be able to pick up on something in that.
Yeah, that's super. You know, like Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, 1783, it's really separated, right? Like that we talk about politics and those conditions, and then we talk about how the individuals should enlighten themselves. There are, criteria, standards for what the Enlightenment, the cultural Enlightenment of the polis would be, but it's tolerance related. Like there's not, except, and this is the tricky bit in some ways. Like the quote I referred to, like he doesn't think like that we should just, punish people or something like that. Like we should try to inculcate those morals. So there is something like, there is something about that kind of practice. Now, I guess the thing is, and so this is I think, maybe against to Helga's paper, like he was so accepting that the Jews were in a small pocket, right? So the morals that could be inculcated would make it easier for a young Jewish kid in the yeshiva to then go and practice and come closer to God. But that wasn't the goal for the whole religious state. I mean, the Jewish laws aren't laws on humanity at large or something like that. And so there was really no, there was no assumption of the inculcation of morals, his anti-Hobbesianism in what an Enlightenment state would do, not just punish. There was no assumption that it would connect, because the Jews would always be in a pocket or something like that. They wouldn't be. And Kant's claim is, yeah, but like that maybe now, maybe then, but that's that's a religious politics, like that. Its base is that religious politics. Even if in the 1770s the Haskalah had come nowhere near to formulating, whatever it is, modern Zionism or something like that, the attempt to produce a Jewish state in which the teaching of those values could be more connected. And so Kant's criticism was like, regardless of that political project, the very thing you want to engage with to bring the person, the Jew, closer to God is a political structure.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I guess now I'm thinking a little bit more, would you agree that a concise way of trying to sharpen the point would be the judgment on Kant's behalf that everything that's being done within the Jewish social community under the name of culture is really just a form of politics or social.
Its roots were.
Yeah, and so then the thought that what's happening is the development of culture is just the wrong name for it, and they don't get that or something.
Just because you're out of power.
Yeah,
it's just because you're
No, that's a helpful point, because then it would be it's not so much the tolerance or intolerance or whatever about culture. It's a judgment that there is no culture really to speak of in a certain sense, at least on this certain track. That's
in whose view would that be? Do you think that would be, that there is no culture like that? Because Mendelssohn named what there was as the Enlightenment.
No, from Kant's point of view,
exactly,
the way you put it.
Exactly,
yeah, no,
exactly.
I think that would be very provocative, and also might help give drama to the dynamism of the paper, which is already really nice. So if you agree to that.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. You know, that there's a point in there where I say something like that. Like Kant, really in the religion writing, like that Judaism is nothing else but a political system. Like that's what it is. Yeah, and it's any truths come out. Yeah, yeah. So thank you. I might. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is just a follow-up comment on that, and also on sort of the last quote in the handout. It's hard not to think in this context of like the very infamous Fichte essay from a few years later, in his French Revolution essay, where he has this proposal that Jews ought to have human rights, but not civil or civic or political rights, because they're opting out of the Republican system or something by being Jewish or something like this. So I don't know if that's exactly the end point of where Kant's going, but it's.
Wait, no, so I like that. I mean, I don't know, I haven't really thought of that, but I love it. I mean, that would be, so if we want to connect these two questions, like that's the problem with Mendelssohn's position from Kant's position. That in some ways, Fichte gave Mendelssohn what he asked for, yeah? And he should have asked for more, is Kant's. I mean, he should have asked more and whatever it is, yeah? So I love it, I'll go there and think that through. But I think that's my view on it in that sort of way. And what's amazing is that, Mendelssohn didn't even hold out hope for more than that. Like his argument was merely to say like, okay, like, Jews should be able to pass on citizenship to their children, or like the next generation shouldn't be kicked out. Like it was no broad, it was really just on making the best of it so that you could keep studying and doing the other thing. I mean, it was. And he did a lot of work. Like he set up the standards to go into courts to be passed around, and he really was, sorry.
Okay, thank you for your very interesting paper. I have some questions. The first question is related to this problem of anti-Semitism by Kant. Not only by Kant, but only in the German classical philosophy from Kant, in this discussion between Kant on the one hand and Mendelssohn on the other hand. It comes the question of Christianism, Judaism, and so on. And it seems that Kant, like by Hegel or Marx, is not in favor or very positive to Judaism, in the sense that Judaism doesn't promote the freedom, doesn't promote the Enlightenment, and so on. How do you see this question by Kant and Judaism and anti-Semitism in the frame of this discussion of German classical philosophy and anti-Semitism? And the second question is related to that, because it seems that this opposition between a religion or a fanatism on the one hand and science, Vernunft, reason, and so on the other hand, seems to be that this it's not the opposition is not so radical by Kant. I mean, are there some versions or variants of religion who promotes and helps and reinforce freedom and Aufklärung? And it seems to be that by Kant is not the case of Judaism, but the case of maybe Protestantism or a version of Protestantism, Pietism, and so on. What do you think about that? And the third question is related to the role of religion by Kant. I mean, I find it's very clear that religion by Kant has a very strong moral function, but it's not so clear of if religion has a political function. And it's a bit surprising, because by Rousseau, the Contrat Social, there is this reflection about civil religion. And by Hegel, later, this is the question of this forced religion, and in opposition to this positive religion, or this false religion, has a very strong political function, namely to reinforce the democratic participation and the identification with the state. But it's not the case by Kant. Or what do you mean about it?
Those are great questions. And so I'm going to give a brief because there's very little time, I think, brief, but then hopefully we can continue the conversation. I'm going to start with the last one. I think absolutely. Like, I think Kant's criticism of Rousseau is that there's there's no idea of reason there to guide us, and we could be developing an education directed to religion or something like that, that in fact was focused on our desires. That we have to be, we need the idea that affords us a certain kind of progress to judge whether education is going in the right direction or something like that. That Rousseau wasn't rationalist enough in a rational idea. So that's my view of Kant's criticism of support of Rousseau, but its criticism of it, that religion isn't a good guide for that. And then sort of working our way back up to the toughest question, anti-Semitism, or toughest question for me maybe, but that Mendelssohn was saying that Judaism does this better than forms of Christianity. I mean, this was the argument that was going on. He just thought that this was different. He thought religion should bring us towards moral truths in some ways. Like, that was the root, so you don't end up like enthusiast or Jacobi or Weizmann or an empiricist or something like that. And so I think that's the position. And so that then Kant's anti-Judaism was an argument that in fact you would be better metaphysically and morally served by accepting this, Christianity or a certain version of Christianity's separation of whatever ideas and metaphysics and religion. And then just as the third, in terms of anti-Semitism, I don't know that that's anti-Semitism. Like, that seems like that is a discussion of religious positions and how they influence us, not of what sort of person they are. And this isn't just a claim that like Kant had a friend who was Jewish, because Kant really liked Mendelssohn. But that they had different views on how one should direct one's life, and that he thought religion had a big role to play in that. There was nothing wrong with the Jewish stock. That there was no biological or genetic anti-Semitism going on here, but there was a real criticism of Judaism, as Mendelssohn offered a criticism of Christianity in the second half of Jerusalem. That Judaism did a lot better than, not than Christ was fine, but post-Christ, like when they stopped following the laws, like that's the issue. Yeah.
So we're out of time. Now we have Michael Rohlf from the Catholic University of North America, who will present to us Fichte's criticism of Kant's FUL and FH.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. Hello. This is the mic. Okay.
Do you want me to give you any warnings of time or something?
Sure.
I'll let you know when you reach 20 minutes, and then when you reach negative.
Okay, sure. Okay, hi, I'm Michael Rohlf. This is the second half of our Kant and session when we transition from Kant and his predecessors and contemporaries to Kant and his contemporaries and successors, or whatever you want to call them. So my title is Fichte's Criticisms of Kant's FUL and FH. Just like it saves me a millisecond each time if I say the formula of universal law as FUL and formula of humanity as FH, so I'll do that. Right, in this paper, I discuss Fichte's criticisms of Kant's methods of deriving and systematizing ethical duties in his 1798 System of Ethics, and the alternatives that Fichte proposes as replacements for Kant's FUL and FH. I want to argue that Fichte's criticisms and replacements of Kant's formulae are plausible and well motivated from within Kant's framework, focusing especially on Kantian duties to oneself in general, and the duty not to commit suicide in particular, if I can get that far. Kant, of course, appeals to FUL and FH to specify duties, suggesting in the groundwork that at least some of the same duties can be derived from either formulation of the categorical imperative. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant again identifies FUL as the principle of all duties and uses it to explain some specific duties, but he says that FH is also required to specify ethical duties of virtue as opposed to duties of right. In the system of ethics, Fichte also adopts two methods for deriving duties, the first of which he explicitly compares to FUL and the second to FH. So these are outlined on the handout, sort of. Fichte's first method of deriving duties, which is in section 18 of the system of ethics, so part of what I'm doing here is I'm sort of trying to get you to read the system of ethics, basically. So section 18 is where you want to go. Involves, he says, providing a complete presentation of the conditions of I-hood and showing how these conditions are related to the drive for self-sufficiency. Fichte identifies three such conditions of I-hood. First, having a body. Second, having a power of reflection, or he says being an intellect. And third, being one individual among many. Fichte uses this method to derive duties corresponding to each of these three conditions of I-hood, and then he turns to discussing the relationship between this method and Kant's FUL. The duties Fichte derives from the first two conditions of I-hood, body and intellect, correspond to what Kant calls a human being's imperfect duties to himself to develop and increase his natural perfection. In the groundwork, Kant derives this type of duty from both FUL and FH, and in the Metaphysics of Morals, he also uses language from both formulas. While Kant mentions duties to cultivate powers of spirit, soul, and body, Fichte lumps the first two of those together under the rubric of intellect. For Fichte, the duty to cultivate one's body includes the following three requirements that are also on the handout. I've labeled them A, B, and C. A is that our body absolutely may not become an object of enjoyment for enjoyment's sake. B is that the body ought to be cultivated in a manner that will make it suitable for all possible ends of freedom. And C is that every enjoyment that cannot be related with sincere conviction to our efforts to cultivate our body in a suitable manner is impermissible and contrary to the law. Kant explicitly articulates B, but does not explicitly articulate A or C as requirements falling under the rubric of duties to cultivate one's body. Yet Kant does explicitly hold that one's own happiness or enjoyment is not a morally necessary end, or an end that's also a duty. Moreover, for Kant, the end of complete conformity of dispositions with the moral law cannot be achieved in this life, but requires endless progress toward that complete conformity. While this end of holiness remains unachieved, then, which is to say at any point in a human life, I suggest it would seem contrary to Fichte, contrary to duty, to divert oneself away from this end by instead pursuing one's own happiness as an end. Indeed, Kant incorporates that very conclusion into his own account of ethical duties of virtue in the Metaphysics of Morals, which include the duty to cultivate one's natural perfection. This duty, Kant says, is wide and imperfect in the sense that individual people may decide differently how and in what proportion to develop their powers of body and intellect, depending on whether they take up a trade, commerce, or a learned profession. But the latitude afforded by this duty to adjust the proportions in which one aims to develop one's natural powers to the profession one has chosen is not to be confused, Kant says, with license to pursue one's own happiness as an end instead. It's rather to be taken, Kant says, only as permission to limit one maxim of duty by another. So I suggest there are plausible Kantian grounds for Fichte's conclusion that we have an ethical duty never to pursue enjoyment for enjoyment's sake, although as usual, Fichte uses more extreme language, and here he departs from Kant's presentation, at least by associating it with the duty to cultivate one's body. Quickly, Fichte uses the third condition of I-hood, individuality, to derive an ethical duty to follow rules of right, retracing in some respects arguments from his Foundations of Natural Right 2 years earlier. He argues that it's a condition of self-consciousness, of I-hood, to assume that there's an actual rational being outside of oneself, from which he infers that I'm not allowed to be self-sufficient at the expense of the other's freedom, and indeed that I'm required to limit myself every time I act freely, thus keeping open the possibility that other possible free beings might act freely as well. The rules that require me to limit my freedom by the freedom of others are the rules of right. So, the ethical duties that Fichte derives by his first method are to follow rules of right and some purely ethical laws regarding one's own body and also theoretical reflection, which I skipped over. At this point in the system of ethics, Fichte, as he often does, poses an antinomy, whose resolution leads into his discussion explicitly of Kant's FUL. The antinomy is that the moral law requires that I strive for absolute or limitless self-sufficiency, but reflection on individuality as a condition of I-hood has yielded the conclusion that I ought to limit my striving for self-sufficiency by rules of right that protect the freedom of others. So, as Fichte puts it, the moral law seems to command that I both do and do not subordinate everything that limits me to my absolute final end. Fichte's resolution of this antinomy is that we must presuppose that all free beings necessarily share the same end, namely the self-sufficiency of all reason as such. This is so, Fichte says, because it's certainly a necessary feature of I-hood that each I is an individual, but only that it be an individual as such, or in general, not that it be the determinate individual A, B, or C, etc. Thus, the goal we share of the self-sufficiency of reason as such does not refer to any specific determinate individuals, from which Fichte infers that there can be no rational ground for preferring my own self-sufficiency to that of any other person. He says, what I will is morality as such. It doesn't matter in the least whether this is in me or outside me. This implies for Fichte that I have just as much reason to care that others act morally as that I myself act morally. Again, he says, if the wish for universal morality is my ruling wish, as surely it ought to be, then I absolutely must wish to abolish any use of freedom that violates the moral law. How should I act on this wish? He says, it's the formal condition of all morality that each person ought to act purely and simply in accordance with his conviction. Conviction's a major subject of Fichte's that I'm barely touching on here. So he concludes that whenever my practical convictions differ from those of other people, I have a duty to seek to convince them of my convictions. And they likewise have a duty to seek to convince me of their convictions, so that we must all seek to make our own judgments harmonize with that of the others. So I'm saying all this because this is the context in which Fichte explicitly comments on Kant's formula of universal law. And here's the long passage on the handout next, which I'll read. He says, Fichte says, we're all supposed to act in the same way. This is the reason for the Kantian proposition, act in such a way that you could think of the maxim of your will as a principle of universal legislation. But Kant's proposition only talks about the idea of an agreement, and by no means about any actual agreement. We will see that this idea has real use, that one ought to seek to realize this idea of agreement and must, to some degree, act as though it were realized. Moreover, this proposition is purely heuristic. I can very well and very easily employ it as a test to determine whether I might have erred in my judgment concerning my duty. It is, however, by no means constitutive. It's by no means a principle, but only a consequence of or an inference from a true principle. That is a consequence of the command concerning the absolute self-sufficiency of reason. The relationship in question is not that something ought to be a maxim of my will because it's a principle of universal legislation, but conversely, because something is supposed to be a maxim of my will, it can therefore also be a principle of universal legislation. So in this passage, Fichte affirms the usefulness of FUL as a defeasible negative criterion of duty. That is, I might, but I might not, have erred in my judgment concerning my duty if it's forbidden by FUL, or the contradiction test, or whatever you want to call it, because any duty could be willed as a universal law. But on the other hand, not everything that can be willed as a universal law, or on which everyone can agree, is ipso facto a duty. So on these grounds, Fichte rejects FUL as a positive criterion of duty. Employing reasoning that recalls Plato's Euthyphro, Fichte claims that what makes something a duty is not that everyone agrees it's a duty, but rather everyone should agree that something is a duty only if and because of the prior fact that it is one, for reasons independent of either actual or ideal agreement. These independent reasons stem from what he calls the command concerning the absolute self-sufficiency of reason. I suggest that Fichte is not criticizing, or doesn't take himself to be criticizing, the basic framework of Kant's ethical theory here, but only Kant's use of FUL as a principle for deriving duties. Fichte is claiming that his own first method of deriving duties from conditions of I-hood captures the spirit of Kant's ethics better than Kant's method of deriving duties from FUL. So I'm going to skip a bit here. Go down to the second method of deriving duties now on the handout, from beginning in section 19. This one employs the principle that reason as such, or the entire community of rational beings outside me, is the object of the moral law. This principle again stems from Fichte's resolution of the antinomy I mentioned earlier, his resolution being that all human beings share the same end of the self-sufficiency of reason as such. But Fichte actually derives duties not directly from this overarching principle, but from subsidiary ones, only the first of which I'm going to talk about here. This subsidiary principle says that, and this is also on the handout now, I am for myself, that is before my own consciousness, only an instrument, a mere tool of the moral law, and by no means the end of the same. Fichte emphasizes that he restricts this principle to how I view myself. Next passage on the handout. For every rational being outside me, to whom the moral law certainly addresses itself in the same way that it addresses itself to me, namely as a tool of the moral law, I am a member of the community of rational beings. Hence I am, from his viewpoint, an end for him, just as he is, from my viewpoint, an end for me. For everyone, all others outside of oneself are ends, but no one is an end for himself. Fichte claims that this principle, when further elaborated, is compatible with Kant's assertion that every human being is himself an end. Now recall, of course, that the formula of humanity says, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Since Fichte's principle denies that we may view ourselves as ends, it's not in fact compatible with the part of FH that says to use humanity in your own person as an end, never merely as a means. But before I get to that, let me first address the compatibility of Fichte's principle with the rest of FH, because some scholars have challenged that, namely the part that says to use humanity in the person of others as an end, never merely as a means. Fichte is clear that each person is to treat all others as ends. But it might be asked whether this claim has the same sense for Fichte as it does for Kant. The translators of the Cambridge edition of the System of Ethics answer this question by rendering Fichte's German as follows. This is the next passage on the handout. This is their translation. Everyone is an end, in the sense that everyone is a means for realizing reason. And I've given you the German there, which I'll comment on in a moment. Fichte continues, this is the ultimate and final end of each person's existence. This alone is why one is here. This does not diminish the dignity of humanity. Instead, it elevates it. Everyone is, for himself and before his own self-consciousness, charged with the task of achieving the total end of reason. So the Cambridge translation renders the German word alls, which I've underlined, as in the sense that. But if Fichte were saying that the phrase, everyone is an end, is always equivalent in sense to the phrase, everyone is a means for realizing reason, which is partly, I think, because of this translation, how he's often read, then it would be difficult to see what he could mean by claiming in the previous paragraph that his principle is compatible even with the part of FH that says every human being is himself an end. However, if what Fichte means in this sentence is instead that everyone is an end because everyone is a means for realizing reason, which I suggest fits the German perfectly well, then his claim to be in agreement with Kant on this point makes sense. On this reading, which I'm proposing, Fichte is not saying that any person is merely a means for realizing reason, but that each person is both an end, at least for others, and also a means for realizing reason. It might be thought significant that Fichte's principle does not say that each person is an end in itself, as Kant often says, for example, when he claims that the ground of FH is that rational nature exists as an end in itself. But Kant's canonical expression of FH, which I read a moment ago from 429 in the groundwork, doesn't include in itself either, which suggests that Kant's phrase end in itself is just equivalent for him to the phrase always at the same time an end, never merely a means, which FH spells out. If so, then Fichte's principle affirms that each person is an end in itself, at least for others. It might also be thought that Fichte's principle runs afoul of Kant's contrast between an end to be affected and an independently existing end, the latter of which Kant says is to be thought only negatively, that is, as that which must never be acted against, and which must therefore in every volition be estimated never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. But this is not so either. As long as we distinguish the sense in which each person is an end, at least for others, from the sense in which each person is a means, rather than identifying them as the Cambridge translation of the system of ethics does, then we can understand Fichte to be saying that we are to treat each other person as an independently existing end because of their ability to affect the end of realizing reason. This would indeed be compatible with Kant's view, quoting from the groundwork again, that morality, and humanity insofar as it's capable of morality, is that which alone has dignity, because of the share it affords a rational being in the giving of universal law, by which it makes him fit to be a member of a possible kingdom of ends. So Fichte's principle is not at odds with what FH says about treating others as ends, but it is clearly intended to be incompatible with what FH says about treating oneself as an end. FH says to treat humanity in one's own person as an end, and Fichte's principle says that no one is an end for himself. Why does Fichte think this part of FH is not worth preserving? To answer this question, I need briefly to jump into how Fichte further elaborates his principle by identifying what he calls conditioned duties. Fichte's class of conditioned duties corresponds loosely to Kant's class of duties to oneself, although Fichte thinks that Kant's category is misconceived. There is, Fichte says, really no such thing as a duty to, where the German preposition there is gegen, and Fichte adds, for the sake of myself, because Fichte says, I am and remain a means for a final end outside of myself. But Fichte does recognize duties auf myself. And instead of quibbling further about prepositions, he simply renames these conditioned duties, using Kantian language, because if the moral law wills something that is conditioned, namely the realization through me of the dominion of reason outside me, then it also wills the condition, namely that I be a fit and capable means for this end. The disagreement between Kant and Fichte about prepositions here is immaterial, I think, because Kant himself says that respect for persons is, strictly speaking, respect for the moral law they exemplify. So Kant can agree that any duty is properly a duty gegen the moral law, whether its immediate object is oneself or others. Kant also agrees with Fichte that I'm not myself the final end of the moral law, which is specified, I think, by the formula of a kingdom of ends. Kant would also concede that any end that is not final is a means to some further end or ends, and ultimately to an end that is final. For Kant, no end, whether final or not, can have a worth other than that which the law determines for it. So conceding that I'm a means to a kingdom of ends does not imply that I'm not also an end, albeit not a final end, or that I'm merely a means to the final end of morality. On the interpretation I've proposed of Fichte's claim that everyone is an end because everyone is a means for realizing reason, Fichte affirms that I am, like everyone else, an end. This is what Fichte says he agrees with about FH, that every human being is himself an end. What he is denying here, however, is that I have any duties to treat myself as an end. Rather, only others have duties to treat me as an end. and I have duties to treat others as ends. But I should treat myself as only an instrument, a mere tool of the moral law, or a mere means to the final end of morality. To see what this departure from Kant amounts to, consider how Fichte derives universal conditioned duties, which is his term for conditioned duties that everyone has, from this subsidiary principle. He proceeds much as he did in his first method of deriving duties from the conditions of I-hood, except that now he derives these duties from the conditions of being a tool of the moral law. There are two such conditions, again on the handout. First, that there's a continuous reciprocal interaction between me and the world, and second, that there's a continuous reciprocal interaction between me and other rational beings. Since I-hood is itself a condition of being a tool of the moral law, all the duties that Fichte derived earlier from conditions of I-hood can also be derived from these conditions of being a tool of the moral law. But this time Fichte derives other duties as well, most importantly the duty not to commit suicide, but instead to preserve as well as cultivate one's body, soul, and their reciprocal influence. Kant, of course, recognizes these duties as well. So for the most part, I take Fichte not to be disagreeing with Kant here about what duties we have, but only about how to derive and characterize those duties. When Kant appeals to FH to explain the perfect duty to oneself not to commit suicide in the groundwork, he says that anyone who destroys himself in order to escape from a trying condition makes use of a person merely as a means to maintain a tolerable condition up to the end of life. In the Metaphysics of Morals, he says that, this is Kant, says that killing oneself is a crime, murder, and he explains, in another long passage on the handout, that a human being cannot renounce its personality as long as he is a subject of duty, hence as long as he lives. And it's a contradiction that he should be authorized to withdraw from all obligation, that is, freely to act as if no authorization were needed for this action. To annihilate the subject of morality in one's own person is to root out the existence of morality in the world as far as one can, even though morality is an end in itself. Consequently, disposing of oneself as a mere means to some discretionary end is debasing humanity in one's own person as homo noumenon, to which the human being, homo phenomenon, was nevertheless entrusted for preservation. So, suicide is wrong, according to Kant, because it involves using the intelligible self merely as a means to an end of the sensible self, while one should always treat the subject of morality in one's own person, that is the intelligible self, as an end, because morality is an end in itself. Failing to treat morality as an end, in other words, by removing the condition of morality in one's own person, is what makes suicide wrong for Kant. This reasoning is compatible with Fichte's explanation for why suicide is wrong. For Fichte, enjoyment is as such never the end of the ethical way of thinking, and therefore no end of the sensible self can be a reason either to preserve oneself or to end one's life. Rather, my life is a necessary condition for carrying out the moral law, and therefore I'm absolutely commanded to live, to the extent that this is something that depends on me. The problem with suicide for both philosophers, then, is that it involves not so much failing to treat oneself as an end, but failing to treat morality as an end and oneself as a means to, or condition of that end. I think Fichte's principle captures this reasoning better than FH does, where the two principles diverge. So, Fichte's principle that I am, for myself, only a tool of the moral law, and his corresponding class of universal conditioned duties do not depart substantively from Kant's use of FH to specify perfect duties to oneself, such as the duty against suicide, but rather attempt mainly to clarify and tighten Kant's reasoning, which in the end Fichte largely adopts but expresses differently. The same cannot be said, however, of Kant's imperfect duties to oneself. Recall that Kant recognizes a duty to cultivate one's natural perfection that allows each person latitude to decide differently from others how and in what proportion to develop their natural powers, depending on whether they take up a trade, commerce, or a learned profession. And that for Kant, this latitude is to be taken only as permission to limit one maxim of duty by another, not as license to pursue one's own happiness as an end. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant also recognizes an analogous duty to increase one's moral perfection, understood both subjectively as the purity of one's disposition to duty, and objectively as fulfilling all one's duties and attaining completely one's moral end with regard to oneself. This duty, Kant explains, is narrow and perfect with regard to its object, but with regard to the subject, it's only a wide and imperfect duty to oneself. So I think that means that we have no latitude in the objective requirement of this duty, but must always fulfill all duties with respect to oneself. And likewise, we must always strive for the end of acting from a pure moral disposition, although we're not required to succeed at achieving this end. Fichte's agreement with the narrow and perfect component of Kant's duty to increase one's moral perfection is reflected in his explicit commitment to rigorism, which is expressed most vividly in his discussion of the duty not to commit suicide in the final passage on the handout. He says, "When I think of myself as standing under the command of the moral law, is it ever really the case, even in this life, that I'm merely permitted to alter my situation, that this is something I am free to do or not to do? Is it not the case instead that it's always either a duty or contrary to duty to alter my situation? Certainly the latter is the case, since the moral law does not leave any leeway at all for my arbitrary choice. Under the dominion of the moral law, there are no indifferent actions. In every situation of my life, I either ought or ought not to do something." So briefly wrapping it up here, the Kantian argument that I sketched earlier for Fichte's conclusion that we have an ethical duty never to pursue enjoyment for enjoyment's sake can be used to support this rigorist conclusion. Since a pure moral disposition cannot be achieved in this life, but requires continual progress at any time during this life, while this end remains unachieved, it would be contrary to duty not to strive for it, that is, in this case, a pure moral disposition. At every moment, then, we have a perfect duty to strive for moral perfection. Kant says that we must strive at each moment, not only for a pure moral disposition, but also toward fulfilling all one's duties and attaining completely one's moral end with regard to oneself. This is a claim not only about the disposition with which one aims to fulfill whatever duties one has, but about the content of one's duty. Namely, that at each moment there is at least one duty that commands some action, even if only the duty to increase one's moral or natural perfection, Fichte would say, as an instrument of the moral law. So, again, I think Fichte can plausibly claim to be expressing Kant's own view when he says that in every hour of my life there's something for me to do. Moreover, if Kant's duties of virtue allow latitude only to limit one's maxim of duty, one maxim of duty against another, but prohibit making exceptions for the sake of one's own happiness, then they also prohibit making exceptions for merely permissible actions that are not in any sense morally required. Fichte can thus plausibly maintain that rigorism is implied by Kant's position, even if it's not clear whether Kant himself thought so. I'll wrap up there.
So we have like 7.5 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
Thanks. Hi,
Hi.
Michael. Hi,
Hi.
Krista. If you wanted me to read the system of ethics, this is not working. I'm sorry.
Oh, darn it.
Okay, I don't know if this is is this my fight with Fichte or is this my fight with you? The reading of Kant as thinking that morality is a thing we have to fulfill, embody. It makes it sound like morality is like outside of us, and that it's a thing we have to come to, we have to work to realize. That just sounds like it's not Kant. I'm sorry. I don't have a better way of putting this. Like this doesn't, that just sounds like it's putting morality sort of like out external. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding Fichte or you or someone.
Maybe
but that just sounds un-Kantian in some ways.
Right. What makes it sound that way? I mean, there are certain ends that have to be realized. Is that what makes it sound that way?
Well, no, it just makes it sound as though morality is like some kind of that it's not, I mean, isn't sort of some of what his project is about is talking about the fact that morality sort of like comes from within the human community, and it's not that would make it seem more like a religious orientation or something, that it's kind of external, it's some consequence we have to bring about.
Yeah, so this is good. Fichte is sometimes read as a consequentialist, because there is a lot of, if you sort of zone in on certain passages, there is a lot of consequentialist sounding language. And you can do that in Kant too. Maybe you're familiar with certain people reading Kant that way. Similar things happen with Fichte, sort of, they track. But as always, the language is more extreme in Fichte. My reading of both of them is the same with this respect. The end that's to be brought about is sort of a projection of reason, of individual human reason. But for Fichte, it's even more community-oriented, because the content of these ends has to come from this kind of dialogue. So it's only at the end of that process, once we've settled what the ends are through sort of self-legislation, but in the context of a community, that it can take on it can give you the impression that these are externally imposed. But maybe maybe it is a fight with me. Maybe that's my fault for skipping that part of Fichte. As I see it, it's not at all externally imposed. The duties are, because they're rationally self-legislated, though, and because they come from a community of reason, they're just not about me as an individual. And this is I think the point that Fichte thinks that Kant didn't fully internalize, because he still has these duties to oneself, and he still gives the individual kind of latitude that just doesn't belong in a purely rational system of morality that Kant himself proposes. But yeah, so maybe that's also part of the reason why it gives the impression, Fichte's version of it gives the impression that it's externally imposed. But I don't think it's supposed to be like that. It's an attempt to purify what Fichte takes, and I don't disagree with Fichte about this, Kant himself to be trying to do.
So for the sake of time, do you want me to group the questions? Or,
sure, thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just because I don't know the Fichte. So where does this leave kind of the need to cultivate virtue in yourself? I mean, that in what you just said in response to Krista, like where does this if there if duties to oneself are so problematic from Fichte's point of view, then where does this leave the kind of the requirement to really work on your ability to conform to the moral law?
I think I'll try to. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to wait. Yeah. I'll try to be quick. I think those duties are exactly the same as they are in Kant. The content of those duties. What Fichte wants to get rid of is the latitude that Kant introduces, so that you don't really have to work that hard at those duties.
Thanks, Michael. Just on the point you were making in response to the first question, do you think, I mean, there is a way in which with Fichte, the pluralism of the realization of the ich or whatever is built in, it's seemingly much higher in the deduction structure from the principle to different kinds of duties. And so, and then for the Kantian, it might feel like I thought I was talking about me when I said I, but then now we're talking about the mysterious universal ich that I am like a little node of or something. And so, yeah, okay, it will be a different way to talk about duties of the ich to itself is different than duties of me to myself in that way. Do you think that understanding of, I mean, so are you trying to say Fichte pushes this on Kant, but you think that's really what Kant should have also said purifiedly in the groundwork about the formulations of the principle of morality, that he should have been more careful to differentiate what the first person pronoun referred to, that it was this absolute ich or something, that Kant really would have already said that? Or is it more like Kant didn't say that, it's not clear he would have wanted to say that, maybe in the Opus Possumum he's saying weird things, but you think it's compatible with everything Kant said that he could have said it. I'm just trying to get the modality of when you say this is a purified Kantianism, yeah, exactly what you want to say on that kind of like metaphysics-y principle.
Yeah. So, quick answer. Earlier version of this paper, I talked, which was longer, I talked about the formula of a kingdom of ends, and I tried to map that onto what Fichte was saying and claim that these are really the same spirit also, and I got that question. Well, I got it in a much more aggressive way. Like, no, they're not the same thing. Kant wasn't trying to do this. So I guess I agree with that. I think it's more, Fichte thinks that this is what Kant should, there's sort of gestures in this direction in Kant, but that's not what Kant's trying to do. So the I enters at a higher level. It's a different I in the end with Fichte. So at this point, yes, Fichte is doing something different, but it's a Kantian spirit. And there's an argument for, if you're going to go part of the way, you need to go all the way.
Okay, so we're out of time, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And we're going to eat 5 minutes into our break. I hope that's okay. So for our final talk on our Kant and series of talks, we have Marcela García-Romero from Loyola Marymount University, who will present to us Schelling after Kant, intellectual intuiting as theoretical presupposition and practical demand.
Así nomás.
Ahí está bien, ¿verdad? ¿O quieres que se nos suba un poquito más?
No, está bien.
¿Empiezo ya? Okay. So, hi everyone, there's 2 handouts. I was trying to upload it and my computer died. So one is just the outline, it's 5 pages. And the other one is just the texts, and there's 3 pages. Yes, thank you. Go. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you for the organizers and for everyone that's here. I also want to say hi to my students who have to watch this because it's in our course. So. All right, so the goal of the paper, it's a paper that I've been working on. It's become rather long, so I've tried to just choose some of the parts that I would be very interested in hearing your feedback about. The goal is to understand Schelling's intellectual intuition better by taking into account the reason why Schelling thinks Kant presupposed an intellectual intuition. And just as a note, I'm not trying to say that they have the same position or that their terms have the same meaning, which they don't, but I do want to point at some parallels that I think will help us understand how it's possible for Schelling to develop intellectual intuition in the same work called Vom Ich from 1795, Of the I, the same work where he's saying he's developing Kant's project. So how can he, in that very same work, then go into this intellectual intuition? How is he understanding Kant's project? And what he says is he's going to make explicit principles that must have been implicit in Kant. And the other thing I'm not talking about in the paper, but if it comes up in the Q&A, I'm not talking about the other possible influences that I'm sure are playing a role here: Fichte, Spinoza, Jacobi, Hölderlin, Plato. So I'm not focusing on those. So Schelling says that Kant, he says three things. Kant presupposed higher principles, he presupposed an absolute I, and he rejected intellectual intuition, which is incompatible with those presuppositions. And I'm going to read from the text, the number 2. This is Schelling. I know very well that Kant denied all intellectual intuition, but I also know where he denied it, in an investigation that only presupposes the absolute I everywhere, and which, out of presupposed higher principles, only determines the empirically conditioned I and the not I in synthesis with the I. So that's the view that Schelling has. Now, before we get into the details of how is Schelling reading Kant that he comes to this view, I want to mention 3 specific problems of interpretation of Schelling's intellectual intuition that I think will become clearer once we take his reading of Kant into account. And these are 3 problems that are constantly debated, even in Schelling's time, but to this day. So one is the question, does Schelling think that intellectual intuition allows us to assure ourselves of the existence of the absolute in one stroke? And Schelling actually thinks this was Hegel's critique, and that Hegel was wrong. The second question, is intellectual intuition a human faculty? Is this something that we as humans can do? And is intellectual intuition of the absolute something we have? And then the third problem, specific to this work, is how is it possible for Schelling to reconcile his arguments about the absolute I as unconditioned, self-evident principle of knowledge with his view of the absolute I as a regulative principle and practical demand for us. So how do both of those go together? Okay, now we move on, and so before we get to the comparison to Kant, briefly, some points about how Schelling introduces this idea about an absolute I that is intellectual intuition. And so the argument goes a little bit like this. He says, knowledge understood as systematically organized totality of contents, this is how he's understanding knowledge, Wissen, presupposes a principle, and as principle, this is unconditioned. Now, as principle of knowledge, it must be self-evident. This means its being and its being grasped must coincide, zusammenfallen. And I used to translate zusammenfallen with collapse, which I like, but then it leads to misunderstanding, so coincide. And this is true of self-grasping, right? Self-grasping would be something that is in virtue of being self-grasping, and self-grasps in virtue of being. Schelling, if you see, you can see in quotes 8 and 9, he speaks sometimes about thinking, right? It is in thinking itself. But as will become clearer very shortly after that passage, he's talking about intuiting. So if it's thinking, it's in any case not any kind of conceptual thinking. And for that reason, I thought self-grasping is a more general term. So for this reason, the principle of unity cannot be an object. Any object of knowledge would presuppose the very knowledge, the very principle of knowledge that makes knowledge possible. Also, an object is by definition conditioned by a subject. So not an object. That's kind of the main thing actually for Schelling the whole time, is that whatever is the absolute I, it can never be an object. The principle is also higher than the subject, understanding the subject as correlative to objects, so also not unconditioned. Now, specifically the Kantian subject, and this is where we start to get into his reading of Kant. The Kantian subject, which is characterized by the synthetic unity of a perception, would be insufficient to account for unity, since it requires external input from sensibility in order to synthesize. And so in that sense, the I think would be merely formal and merely logical. It exists only in relation to the unity of objects. of representations. And you can see some quotes about this, 5, 6, and 7, where Schelling is explicitly criticizing the Kantian subject, but we'll get back to that when we look at some Kantian texts. Now, because of the I structure of this principle and its unconditioned character, Schelling calls it absolute I. The absolute I consists in intellectual intuiting as a self-transparent self-grasping that has no object. You can see this on quote 14, has no object. Since the absolute I can never be an object and is therefore not sensible intuition, therefore it must be another kind of intuition, intellectual. And the expression, therefore, intellectual intuition of the absolute implies a subjective genitive. It is the absolute's own self-intuition, right? It's not our intuition of the absolute. And I'm going to read part of quote 13, where I think this becomes very clear, but also quotes 10, 11, and 12 explicitly say that the absolute I just is in intellectual intuition. So quote 13, the last 3 sentences, we only attribute, he's quoting Kant, by the way, he's quoting Kant on the term intellectuel versus intelligible, and he says intellectual are only activities, acts of cognition, not objects. And so if we're talking intellectual, again, we're not talking objects. And so he says intellectuality, we apply it only to that which cannot become object at all, to the absolute I. In the absolute I, which can never become an object, the principium essendi and cognoscendi, the principle of being and being known, coincide. For that reason, one must apply the expression intellectual to the I as well as to its intuition. And so this is something that a lot of times in the literature, I think somehow people, well, anyway, it sounds sometimes like people separate intellectual intuition from absolute I. In my interpretation, it's clear in the text that he's thinking of them together. So the absolute I, because it's this intellectual intuition is not determined by concepts, he says. These are limited and correspond to objects. This corresponds to text 16. The absolute I, which consists in intellectual intuition, is then, my interpretation, a perspective of non-distinction. Non-distinction between being and thinking, non-distinction between subject and object, and as we will see later, non-distinction between modalities, non-distinction between doing and ought, tun and sollen, non-distinction between mechanism and teleology. So perspective of non-distinction. And knowledge presupposes such a perspective of non-distinction. And there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is, and I gave you 2 quotes that are not actually from this work, from 1795. Quotes 17 and 18 are a little bit later, but I think they clarify this idea of how the non-distinction between subject and object, between knowing and known, is presupposed by knowledge. So Schelling speaks there, this quote, part of quote 17, about the evidence in all evidence, the truth in all truth, what is purely known in all that is known. So the idea would be that knowledge itself already, in a way, presupposes that subject and object must have been non-distinct before they became distinct. And then the other aspect, and this is where I think maybe, and in case anyone is interested in the Fichte, I mean, up to this point, it sounds very similar to Fichte, he's using the same terms, but I think this is where it becomes a little different, is where Schelling emphasizes the reality of knowledge. He uses the term Realität. And from the very beginning of the work, he says, if we didn't have a principle, knowledge would have no reality. But if you look at what he means by that, it's nothing related to existence. And we can see this in quote 21. The perfect system of philosophical science, of knowledge, Wissenschaft, proceeds from the absolute I, excluding everything that stands in contrast to it. So this is a principle. This, as the one unconditionable, conditions the whole chain of knowledge, circumscribes the sphere of all that is thinkable, and as the absolute all-comprehending reality, rules the whole system of our knowledge. And so he emphasizes the content understood as reality, as a sort of organic unity, right? And the principle would be what would be not just formal, but also generating or allowing this sort of Inbegriff aller Realität. So another echo of Kant with the totality of reality, but very clearly understood as the totality of thinkable content, as we saw. And this also clear in quote 22. It's clear that he uses Realität as opposed to existence, right? So Realität really refers to thinkable content, Sachheit, but not to reality in the sense of Wirklichkeit or actuality. And this will be important because, last point, as a totality of reality in that sense, the absolute I is not actual, it's not existent, it is what he says, what he calls absolute pure A-model being, which will, as we will see later, turn out to be really possibility, right? Intelligibility, possibility. So now, with this brief overview of Schelling's steps, I propose the following understanding of intellectual intuition in Vom Ich. The absolute I is an intellectual intuiting. Intellectual intuiting is a perspective of non-distinction in those different ways that we mentioned. Intellectual intuiting makes possible a totality of reality as systematic whole. Intellectual intuiting is presupposed by knowledge. Intellectual intuition is not primarily a faculty of the human subject. Although we will get to the question, well, what kind of access do we have? But before we do that, now that we have a very brief overview of Schelling's position, how is this related to Kant? Why does Schelling say Kant presupposed an intellectual intuition? So some passages from Kant that I think are relevant, some of them Schelling refers to explicitly, and some he doesn't, but or very indirectly perhaps. First is passages from the Critique of Pure Reason in relation to apperception, to the pure apperception, to the unity of apperception. And as I was mentioning, Schelling thinks synthesis cannot be the highest kind of unity. Synthesis is presupposing a higher kind of unity. And there is a passage in the Transcendental Deduction at the beginning where it sounds like there's some ground in the text for Schelling to say, well, look, Kant himself is presupposing this, right? It's a rather long passage, but I highlighted or I italicized some of the passages. This is quote 24. And this is where Kant is saying that synthesis is an action, right? This act of self-activity that must originally be unitary and equally valid for all combination, and it is presupposed by analysis, by any sort of analytic unity. But synthesis or combination requires a representation of the unity of the manifold, right? It's not, in a way, the highest in that sense, right? It requires a representation of unity. And so if I'm going to read the second half of the text, this unity, which a priori precedes all concepts of combination, is not that category of unity, for all categories are grounded on logical functions in judgments, but combination, and with it the unity of given concepts, is already thought in these. The category, therefore, already presupposes combination. But he already said above that combination does not generate the representation of the unity of the manifold, but rather that unity makes combination possible. So he says, we must therefore seek this unity as qualitative, someplace even higher, namely in that which itself contains the ground of the unity of different concepts in judgments, and with it, of the possibility of the understanding, even in its logical use. And so you're the Kantians, you tell me. But we can fight about, how exactly we understand this, but it sounds like Schelling found that sort of quotes that he needed, right? Like there's something even higher than synthesis. So this is the ground of the possibility of the understanding. So the subject, the Kantian subject, in a way presupposes another kind of unity. Right? Okay. Now, there's a couple more passages from Schelling, but we'll leave it there. Second group of passages would be also from the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant is talking about the legitimate use of ideas, right? The regulative use of ideas. And, as you know, Kant says the idea of a greatest systematic unity of nature is inseparable from the use of human reason. reason demands this greatest systematic and purposive unity of nature as a regulative principle to ground its investigation of nature. And Kant understands human reason's striving for unity as a subjective maxim, an interest of reason. Right? So what the logical principle of the unity of reason demands is for us to seek unity, right? For unity to be brought about, not to already say it will be found, but to seek it. Now, however, in order for that not to be in conflict, we need to assume or presuppose that reason is objective in nature, assume it as objective, as belonging to the objects, and we need to assume it as if experience were an absolute unity, and as if this unity had a singular supreme ground outside its scope. Now, within this context, it's something that I found really interesting, that I think is going to be helpful for us to see the parallels with Schelling, is a distinction Kant makes between, in this context, between absolute presupposition and relative presupposition. Two uses of transcendental presupposition of a ground of systematic unity. So absolute presupposition would presuppose the object of the idea in itself. But we have no concepts that allow us to determine the object, right? Because it's outside experience. In contrast, through relative presupposition, we presuppose the object only as a something, ein etwas, that we don't cognize in itself, but only in relation to systematic unity as its ground. So we don't seek to cognize the ground as an object determined by concepts, but only to use the idea. And in a way, there's a passage where he says the reality of the idea, or of the object in the idea, right? So in a way, again, the thinkable content of the idea as a schema to apply the rule to order cognition. And here's where we start getting closer to what Schelling wants to see, right? In order to consider everything as derived from the ground, we must presuppose it as an archetypal reason, he says. He also says an intellect, an understanding later on. So I want to underline as a grasping, as a kind of grasping, as a perspective. And it belongs to the essence of our human reason to think of itself as modeled upon this Urbild. Right? So we have a few passages in relation to this. 30, 31, 32 are the ones where, he's saying, in order for this to fulfill the role that we require, we need to think about the ground of unity as a highest intelligence. In order for it to serve as a schema, it has to have this sort of self-transparency, as it were. In 31, we need to think it or assume it as an independent, original, and creative reason. And this will allow us to think of things as if they had been derived from that original image of all reason. So this is the Urbild aller Vernunft. And then finally, this quote in 32 where he says, this idea is inseparably bound with the essence of our reason. So yes, definitely a regulative principle, but also in a way, in order for it to work, we need to understand it in a certain way that, first of all, as objective, as pertaining to the object, and as having the supersensible ground, but then also the ground having this sort of transparency or intelligibility to it, and therefore reason, intellect, or understanding in the critique of judgment. And then that leads me to a third point. In the paper, I developed this in more detail, but here I'm just going to mention it. In the critique of judgment, paragraph 76, 77, which Schelling said, paragraph 76, this is the, never before and never again will so many deep thoughts be as condensed as in this passage. So, yeah, he really liked it. We must think, in this paragraph 76, Kant says, we must think, in order for us to understand the limitation of our own understanding, we must contrast it, we must think of an intuitive understanding for whom, in my view, for whose perspective, there would be no distinction between modalities, between doing and ought, between tun and sollen, or between mechanism and teleology. And so, because I said I would just mention it, but the point here is very clear that it would be for such an understanding that these distinctions would not stand, right? Like you really would have a sort of collapse there, which would be problematic because we need those distinctions. For instance, we need the idea of necessary existence, but if that were determining the object, then it would collapse. We would have no necessity because for this kind of intuitive understanding, there is no distinction between, possibility, actuality, or necessity. So we get to the parallels. Oh, okay. Quicker. We get to the parallels, all distances saved between Kant and Schelling. All distances saved. 1, the ground of systematic unity, we must presuppose, is a perspective of non-distinction. Intellectual intuiting or intuitive understanding. For these purposes, I'm not making a distinction. Also, in the Critique of Judgment, Kant mentions them in the same passage. Although I know some people make this distinction very important. So, in the same sense, this ground of unity is not an object, it is not determined by concepts, and it is not actual or existent. Second point, this higher ground of systematic unity is a regulative principle for us. And third, its presupposition is essential to our reason. And so at this point, you might think, well, okay, fine, but the main thing here is the regulative aspect, right? The subjective maxim, the interest of reason. Is Schelling simply ignoring that? And so, in fact, Schelling understands the absolute I also as a regulative principle and demand for us in practical philosophy. So notwithstanding all that argument we saw about the principle of knowledge, it's also a regulative principle. So how is this possible? And the reason Schelling is able to do this is that he distinguishes between two perspectives. So throughout the whole work, he's distinguishing between a pure I, which would be self-complete, devoid of objects, the absolute I, and an empirical I, or finite I, which is in relation to objects. So the absolute I, the pure I, makes the empirical I possible. It is the reason it is an I at all. But they have these different perspectives. So insofar as the absolute I is the principle of knowledge and the ground of possibility of both object and subject, you could say we ascend to it. Schelling uses the term. I think hinaufsteigen, via presupposition from the standpoint of the empirical one. But in order to begin from it, in order for it to be the principle, it must be absolute. So in a way, we are both ascending to it, but then also isolating it and considering it as sort of detached from its role as principle of everything else. And in that sense, it would be, Schelling says, immanent. Pure, self-intuiting, immanent, determined only by the laws of its nature and essence. And so we presuppose it as principle of, but we have to at the same time say, in itself, it is absolute intellectual intuition that is immanent. And in that sense, all we can do is presuppose it. We can only point at it. Right? We ultimately cannot really start from it, because we are always already among objects. We're always already in an empirical actuality in existence. And so it turns out to be the case that that whole argument we had, it's something that we have to presuppose. And he uses that term, voraussetzen. So from the finite standpoint, we presuppose the absolute I, theoretically, and practically, we must bring about the unity, precisely because it is not already actual, right? And we'll say a little bit more about that sort of status of the presupposition. So from the finite perspective, the absolute I is a regulative principle and a practical demand to bring about unity, an infinite demand to bring about unity throughout the history of humanity, throughout infinite duration of time. And so in this sense, the distinction between finite and infinite perspectives is what allows Schelling to have, from the finite perspective, the absolute I, both as theoretical presupposition and practical demand, but in itself, the absolute I would not be defined, right? It would be neither nor. It would be neither practical nor theoretical. And so it's a sort of distinction between perspectives that allows him to have those two directions. All right? Yes. Let me say just one point about the main difference, right? The main difference between Kant and Schelling, I think in this sense, is that the way they are understanding presupposition is different, right? So for Schelling, presupposition seems to be ontological and rather than epistemical. When Schelling speaks about how our being I presupposes a non-distinction between subject and object, or how the absolute as non-distinction is the presupposed horizon of intelligibility of the practical demand. He says even the practical demand, in a way, requires us to assume that there is, it doesn't exist, it's not actual, but somehow there is this non-distinction between subject and object, modalities, tun and sollen, and so on. So I think that in that sense, the subjective demand for unity that Schelling also admits, right, the subjective aspect, the interest of reason, it in a way for Schelling assumes what in itself is not subjective, because it is that non-distinction between subject and object. So in a way, the I, the empirical I, the finite I, points us at this sort of broader, infinite expansion, he calls it, of I-hood in general. And just final thing, how does this solve the three problems of Schelling's intellectual intuition? Does Schelling think that intellectual intuition allows us to assure ourselves of the existence of the absolute with one stroke? No. That would be not just opposed to Kant, but also would make the absolute into an object, which Schelling insists it can never be. Schelling is clear that the absolute I cannot be an object, cannot be determined by concepts, and is not actual or existent. So it's not about existence. It's more about thinkable content, intelligibility. B, is intellectual intuition a human faculty? Well, we have to have some access to it if it's going to be a principle of knowledge. However, the absolute I-hood is not identical with our I-hood, right? It's in a way what we are always referring to, both practically and theoretically, in a presupposition, and therefore it's not one and the same. We don't have absolute I-hood, and thus intellectual intuition is not, properly speaking, a human faculty, even though we share in it. And then third question, how do we share in it? That leads us to the third problem. How does Schelling in For mich reconcile the absolute I both as principle of knowledge, that is presupposed, in theoretical philosophy, and as practical demand in practical philosophy, or as infinite demand in practical philosophy? And I said the key to this is the distinction he makes between infinite and finite perspectives. So, final sentence, intellectual intuition, in a way you could say, retreats from or evades both theoretical and practical philosophy in different ways, right? In theoretical philosophy, as that which is always already behind us, presupposed, it's almost, he says, immanent, right? So on this side of subjectivity, it's not supposed to be transcendent. And for the practical perspective, as an infinite demand. So the absolute is in us, both as presupposition of immanent unity, of non-distinction, and as demand to bring about objective unity. And this is the way that we share in intellectual intuition. Thank you.
All right, so we have like 7 or so minutes for questions.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm Avery Goldman. I don't know if we're still doing it. But so just a quick, I know it was an aside, but it's so interesting to me that Schelling so loved Kant's section 76 at the end of the Krieg of Judgment. Heidegger also thought that was where everything happened. But it seems a little strange, like Schelling collapses the very distinctions that Kant offers in that section. Like that it seems like Kant is offering the variety of ways that the soul, the world, and God need to be taken up in some ways, and Schelling seems to focus those in the I, so you I don't know why you need that section. I don't know why Schelling would view that section as the most, when, yeah, I do. I think it is, to me, that, yeah. Anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. I didn't go into his,
I'm sorry.
But that's okay, I can say a little bit. So he thinks that what is allowing us to say that theoretical and practical philosophy are not completely separate, which was one of the complaints, right, of the post-Kantians, like, oh, Kant left things so separate, we need to unify them more, is that what becomes clear in paragraph 76, in his reading of paragraph 76, is that whatever we are aiming for, whatever that practical demand to bring about unity is the collapse, right? So the goal that we will never reach, that we can constitutively never reach, is the collapse, is a coincidence of the distinctions Kant makes. But it is an infinite goal. It is an infinite striving or demand. So because we are always finite, we cannot actually reach the collapse, right? And that illuminates, in a way, once he gets to that part, which is at the very end of the work, I think that illuminates what he was doing at the beginning when he was saying, oh, the principle of knowledge is the non-distinction. Is now, in my reading, this is underlining that because we are always finite, that principle of knowledge is for us only something we sort of presuppose, we point at, without really actually having it as a beginning, if that makes sense. It's behind us. And I didn't mention this, but I think reading the Vom Ich, which is basically his first work, in this way, makes sense of a lot of later developments in Schelling, which other readings cannot account for. So, for instance, later he will make a big deal out of temporality, anticipating Heidegger as well, I think. So, in a way, the practical aspect is the future, but it's constitutively future. It will never be present. And the theoretical presupposition, the absolute, in that sense, is the past, but constitutively past. Right? It was never present. It's always behind us. Thanks.
Thank you. This is your question. Just a question about the presupposition bit. I wonder if you can say more about that, because the intellectual intuition is, I don't read it as a presupposition of the human intellect, especially in the context of section 76. It's entertained as this tool so we can understand the kind of cognition we have better. I mean, the whole point is that we don't have that, right? And it is supposed to explain why our distinctions, the modal distinction, the is-ought distinction, the mechanism, teleology distinctions are ultimately subjective distinctions or ultimately mind-dependent distinctions. But that doesn't necessarily entail that we presuppose the non-distinction perspective, right?
Wouldn't you think that we presuppose it, even though they are both using presuppose in a different sense? But that even for Kant, we...
You said it, yeah, and I didn't quite get that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think Schelling is using presuppose ontologically, right? And Kant isn't. But even so, it's interesting to me that the structure is similar, so that you have Kant saying not just, oh, we need to presuppose this thing or this object, and then, once we have that, it's a presupposition, so it's only als ob, right? But once we have that, everything will make sense. But that Kant is saying, how would things look like for that intuitive understanding, right? And okay, we can't really grasp it because it's, we're finite, but he still kind of says a lot about how things would look like for it. And that's what I'm interested in, that sort of perspective. And it's interesting for me because then I want to say intellectual intuiting is a perspective. Perspective doesn't quite capture it because perspective is limited, right? But it's a seeing, it's a grasping, and in a way a self-grasping, which is what generates the non-distinction. And so that is what is interesting to me, is that intellectual intuition is not something we have, but it's in a way being understood as intelligibility, if that makes sense.
We have a question for Michael and one from several others. So do you want to group them?
Sure. May I, is Thomas here? No, he's like, can I do to you what Thomas did to me? I still have 5 minutes on my...
Yes, but still, if you want to answer
we can bundle them, it's okay.
Yes,
So I had two comments that Michael, that I wanted, that this question helps me to merge into one. It seems like you or Schelling, or both of you, whatever, could helpfully appeal to, in Kant, the ideal of pure reason chapter, the beginning part of it especially, where it does seem like it's a presupposition to Kant, especially with Schelling's distinction between reality as thinkable content and existence. It does, it could be read as a presupposition of just reason, right, that we have the idea of like the sum total of all thinkable contents in Schelling's sense. and then there's a certain, it's a matter for interpretation. At what point along Kant's story of how that refines itself into an ideal, he stops agreeing with it and starts criticizing it, but it certainly looks like he goes a long way with that process. So that sounds a lot like what Schelling's saying. Maybe again, it's presupposition in a different sense, but I'm still not sure I know what that means. But it seems like some kind of presupposition for Kant of having reason. So that.
Thank you so much. I love that comment. Absolutely, Schelling uses the same term. I mean, I think it's a very clear reference. Inbegriff aller Realität. This is something I'm always asking people who work on Kant, because it seems to me that Kant keeps it, right? Even when he's talking about Inbegriff aller empirischen Realität, that came up the other day in one of the talks. It's like the idea that we need the totality to presuppose it in order to have thoroughgoing determination, even once we have said this will only work for empirical content. And so, yes, thank you so much. I mean, that's perfect. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcela. I'm Clinton. I was wondering if you had thoughts about, the presupposition relation with the original intellectual intuition doctrine. How does it play out in the same next few years in relation to the philosophy of art, and so that the proper organ for philosophical comprehension of the absolute, not the intuition, but the comprehension, will play itself out and eventually be art or aesthetic something? Does he think that there's a demonstration of the existence not just as presupposition in relation to whatever we might be able to do, but there's a different kind of deduction of the actuality by the fact of art in some way, and so the encounter with art supplies the actuality of intuition in relation to a bunch of other stuff, but in a way that's just different than this quasi-reasoning back or whatever this mode is. Do you see any connection there? Is this like the specification of the concept and then the art is the appeal to art? I mean, at the very end of the Ich-Schrift, there's also like, we're going from theoretical to practical, and then it's like breathless, one paragraph, like teleology and something else, and then like, so I don't know if you could say a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. So yeah, in the 5 years later, System of Transcendental Idealism, 1800, this is the context just for everyone else. He says that intellectual intuition becomes graspable through aesthetic intuition. And that's the only way it can be sort of objectified or thematized. So you're right, I hadn't thought about it, but it sounds like that would be his attempt of giving it more flesh, right? It cannot just retreat and retreat, there has to be more. And the way he thinks about that is that it is actually, the connection I see to this work from Ich is that the way he understands the practical demand at the end is not that we actualize the absolute unity, but that we absolutize empirical existence. And so in a way you can see them converging. And I think that's the case also for art, right? That you have this sort of absolute activity and human activity, just to put it briefly, that are sort of converging, right? You're, as a human actor, agent, you're being inspired. And so something larger than you is sort of carrying you or inspiring you. And so that, yeah, thank you, that's super helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Marcela. It was very, very interesting, but I have some problems with this Schelling conception of the I. Because I am in German, eine Ontologisierung und eine Hypostasierung des Ichs. And I mean, if you find this I in this very, very general level, it's very difficult to descend from this general level to the particular objects on the one hand, and to the other subjects on the other hand. And if you have these problems with connecting this absolute I with other subjects, it's very difficult to think about intersubjectivity and moral philosophy and political philosophy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think at this stage he's not clear because there's a formulation in this work where he says this work is about Kant, and Kant's work is actually about how the absolute I comes out of itself and posits the finite. And that's exactly what doesn't work. And then the rest of the work doesn't really go back to that formulation. That's in the preface. But it's very problematic because and it's problematic also for my reading, right? That's also why I want to say it's always behind us, it's always a presupposition, and not an actual beginning, actually, right? Because then you would have to explain, how does difference come in the picture, right? If it's this pure self-grasping, how does it become sort of concrete and existent and so on? And I think he struggles with that for a while until he finally, at some point stops talking about the absolute in this sense, in this sort of pure identity. But he does struggle with this for like maybe the next 7, 8 years. So he agrees with you that it's a huge problem. And I do too. Thank you.
So are we okay on timer?
I am okay. Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you.
That's it for our
Thank you.
Kant and something. We have 5 minutes to move to